All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dr. David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos. And tonight we have a community-sponsored stream. That's right. This one is sponsored by actually you guys out there. We did a super chat goal for 50 super chats in a stream, of which you guys attained the goal. And I asked, what sponsored stream topic would you guys be interested in? And you said an Orthodox perspective on the Crusades. And so, in prep for this, I was going to do it again. I've had a bunch of technical difficulties on my end with the internet and stuff like that. I was going to do it, I think, a week and a half ago. I devoted hours. I watched documentaries on the first, the second, the third, and the fourth Crusades. I found a couple things to read on it. And I'm pretty excited to present it to you guys tonight because there's really nothing on the internet. I did find a couple like academic articles that spoke about it, but nothing for like the average person to sort of digest the Crusades from an Orthodox perspective. So that's what we're going to be getting into today. And here's how the stream is going to be structured. So I put together a study guide. In the study guide, it begins by showing the paradigm differences between East and West, because we're talking about the Latin West, the Catholic Church, and we're talking about the Greek East, the Orthodox Church. And mind you, the Crusades occur after the Great Schism of 1054. Okay, so there's a lot building up into the Crusades and how it's viewed from the Orthodox perspective. So we're going to look at the worldview differences. I got a timeline of important events. And then I have the major Latin figures through basically the fourth Crusades. Really, much of our conversation today is only focusing on the first four Crusades because the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, and the eighth, besides the eighth, they basically all occurred during the time the Latins occupied Constantinople. So it basically occurred during the fourth Crusade, if you will, at least from the Orthodox perspective. So I got an overview of all four Crusades. So worldview differences, timeline, overview of the Crusades, the major Latin figures, the major Orthodox figures, and I got 5 myths, 5 common myths describing the Crusades that are false from the Orthodox perspective. And so the goal, as I have a little bit of an opening monologue, I basically want to give you guys the full overview. And the only video out there is a Kings and Generals video that talks about the Crusades from a Byzantine perspective. And we're going to watch about 16 minutes of that. It's like an 18-minute video, but about 2 minutes in is when the video really starts. So I'm going to provide you guys the full overview. Like, what is the actual Orthodox sentiments regarding the Crusades and why do they feel that way? Then we're going to watch the 16-minute overview video, okay? Because it's big overview. It's the whole big picture. Then I'm going to walk you through the timeline of the Crusades from the Orthodox perspective, the major figures, and we're going to dive into specifics. So I have like a 5-hour documentary. We're going to be watching the sections that are important to us from the Orthodox perspective. Then we'll get into a little bit of the second Crusade. I have no videos that I planned on showing you guys regarding the third Crusades. And then the fourth Crusade, I have a video, another great video by Kings and Generals. They're all by Kings and Generals today. They have the best videos on the Crusades. It's just a fact. I have one on what the Catholics, the Latins, stole during the sacking of Constantinople. And I would like, if you guys are interested, it may be not as, again, I don't know, as interesting for some. I think it's fascinating. But you know some of the eschatological prophecies about St. John III, Ducus Vitatis, the Marble King? Well, I wanted to show you guys a little bit of St. John Vitatis from him taking over as the emperor of the Empire of Nicaea, outside the Byzantine, the Catholics are occupying Constantinople, and how he set the stage for the retaking of Constantinople. It's one of the reasons, one, he was an incredible man, but his efforts and what he was able to accomplish is one of the reasons why he's actually a saint of the Orthodox Church. And so that was the goal for today's stream. So we're not going to be getting into specific details. We will be talking about the taking of Antioch, because that is a big turning point from the Byzantine perspective. But I don't have anything for the Third Crusade. Generally, that's Richard the Lionheart. Really, from the Western perspective, the only real successful crusade is the First Crusade. So anyways, that gives you guys a little bit of an understanding of where we're going to go tonight. So let me begin with my opening monologue here. It's not big. It's just trying to give you guys the grand picture. And then we're going to watch our general overview. And then we're going to get into specific details about the story. So smash that like, guys. Thank you all so much for being here. Also, if you have any questions or comments as we move through today's stream, feel free to send in those through Super Chats, whether on Dono Chat or Streamlabs or here on YouTube, whatever you prefer. And we are trying to reach the 30 Super Chat goal for this evening. Okay, so here we go. Most people think they understand the Crusades, but almost everything we hear about the Crusades is coming from a Western perspective. Very few people, and even in preparation for today's stream, very few people articulate the Crusades from the Orthodox Christian perspective. And so the West, and this is probably the history that most of us were brought in, they view the Crusades as a sort of heroic pilgrimage. It's Christians taking back the Holy Land. They're liberating the Christians from the evil Muslims. And then they eventually conquer and take back Jerusalem, a sort of pinnacle of European Christian pride in what they were able to accomplish against all odds. But from the Orthodox perspective, what the Crusades are is essentially a misalignment that leads to immense tension and then ultimately absolute betrayal. And so what do I mean? The story of the Crusade from the Orthodox perspective does not begin with Jerusalem. It does not begin with Urban II, Pope. It does not begin in Paris or anything like that. We're looking at the Crusades from the perspective of Constantinople, not Rome or Paris. And so the story begins with really considered the ultimate defeat, or one of the worst defeats in the history of the Byzantine Empire, the Battle of Manzikert. And this is on the eastern side of Anatolia. Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Anatolia is the geographical region, the name for that region. We're not going to be referring to it as Turkey, and we're not going to be referring to it as Istanbul. The eastern edge of the then Roman Empire at the end of the 11th century, the 1000s, about, I think it's 1075, the Byzantine under Emperor Romanos has a humiliating defeat against the Seljuk Turks. And in this defeat, they lose massive amount of soldiers, and they essentially open up the interior sections of Anatolia. And so what happens is the empire becomes in a succession crisis for an emperor. They're being lambasted by the Seljuk Turks, who end up occupying and taking over aspects of Anatolia. Essentially, the Byzantine Roman Empire losing much of its territory due to the conquest of the Turks. And so we get then the rise of an important emperor of the Byzantine period, Alexios Komnenos, Alexios I. And what he does is, one, he rises to power due to successful battles in which he was able to attain victory. And one of which was actually a Norman. As we'll see, there was a Norman that after the Seljuk Turks began to take over territory in Anatolia, the Byzantine Empire hires a bunch of Norman mercenaries. And these Normans, who, again, they had their own little kingdom at the bottom of Italy at this point, okay? The Normans come to the Byzantium, and though they're paid to fight for the Byzantines, once they get there, one of the princes decides to actually just cut out his own state. And so there is a period in which the Byzantines hire the Norman. This is before the First Crusade. Hire a Norman, and he, as a prince, begins to develop his own state. It's Alexios Komnenos who's then commissioned by the Byzantine emperor to put an end to this. And so what he does is he then hires the Seljuk Turks, who then are in opposition to this Norman Latin knight, prince. I guess he's not a knight, he's a prince, but he has a bunch of Norman knights under him. And let's face it, the knights, the Western knights were, in regards just to an individual soldier, the Western knights were superior. It's just a fact. That's what the West had going for them, is that the knight was a superior soldier. And so Alexios hires the Seljuks to essentially arrest the Norman prince, and that's how they're able to do away with that little kerfuffle they had in Anatolia. So this is all before the First Crusade. Now, Alexios stabilizes the Byzantine Empire, but he's lost massive amounts of territory in Anatolia at this point. And so what he does is he requests Western mercenaries for the purpose of reconquering Anatolia. This is the commission that Alexios sends out to Pope Urban II. Now, the Crusades begin, again, not as the Western idea of some holy war, but as a Byzantine appeal to the West for soldiers in the defense and survival of their empire. And so, now mind you, this is in the, we're now in the 1090s. Okay, 1054 is the Great Schism. There's already immense cultural tension between the East and the West. They already have unique identities. The Latins do not view themselves as Orthodox. I mean, by the time of Charlemagne, you have the Holy Roman Empire cementing the Filioque as an oppositional doctrine against the Orthodox. All of this has already taken place. So these are not brothers in arms per se, but pragmatic Christian civilizations, the Orthodox appealing to the West to bring knights and mercenaries so that they can fight off the Muslims in Anatolia. This is totally transformed in the West. Pope Urban II calls what's called the Council of Clermont. And in it, he establishes a new understanding of a holy war, just war theory, but with penitence offered to soldiers who go and conquer in the name of the Pope. So the war changes into a pilgrimage. Violence becomes a spiritual act accepted by the Catholic Church as a form of martyrdom. And authority is totally centralized under the papacy. And so what Byzantium asked as a strategic alliance, the West proclaimed as a sacred war. The central problem, they are two completely different expectations. You see, Byzantium controlled military aid. They wanted a restoration of imperial lands. They wanted some obedience of the Western soldiers to the Orthodox emperor, since he's the one that's giving them money, giving them food, aiding them in more weaponry, giving them horses when they don't have it. This was all part of the expectation. But because it's, again, Pope Urban II and the call of this holy war in the First Crusade, it totally changes the perspective. And mind you, in the East, they didn't have the same understanding that if you just go and die in defense of, let's say, the Patriarch or Byzantium, that you're sinless. It actually wasn't that at all. In the Orthodox perspective, we're not pacifists, so soldiers go and they fight in battle. The difference is, for the Orthodox, you as a military soldier, and say you were one of the top generals, the Orthodox, the Byzantine Empire is filled with incredible generals, incredible soldiers. But if you killed, again, you would have to confess to a priest how many people you killed, what you did in battle, and you would be given penitence, and you would be taken away from the Eucharist, and then reinstituted into the body of Christ to commune during the liturgical services. So this was the modus operandi of the Orthodox Church. War was seen as necessary, unfortunately, due to the fall. It was a necessary aspect of life, but they did not sacralize war or the mass killing of non-Orthodox Christians as a form of salvation. as a form of indulgence. You see, what Pope Urban does is he offers all people going to the Holy Land to fight indulgences that if they go there, they don't have to worry about their sins anymore. The Pope has eradicated their sins. And so from the very beginning, both sides think they're cooperating, but they're not. They're not playing the same game. You see, they have totally different ambitions. For the crusading Latins, it's a religious mission. It's totally independent of leadership, and that's why even amongst the Crusaders, there's so much infighting, as we'll get into today. And there's differences between even their own goals. We'll find some of the Crusaders actually live up to their loyalty, because when the Crusaders get to Constantinople and the emperor has to usher them across the Bosphorus so they can actually get into Asia and then move through Anatolia down into the Levant, they have to make an oath to Alexios I that any land that the Crusaders conquer must be given back to the Byzantine emperor. And in exchange, the Byzantine emperor will support their crusade through money, through food, through weapons, through horses, through navigational access, giving them various guides to show them how to get around the territory or how to avoid the Seljuks in this particular field, or whatever it may be. And that all ends once Antioch is taken over, the siege of Antioch, which lasts for a long time. I mean, the Crusade is almost over right when it gets started with the siege of Antioch. And by a miracle, the Catholics, right at the last moment, are able to take Antioch right before a horde of Muslims arrive to destroy their siege. And once they take over Antioch, Beaumont, he is a Norman prince of southern Italy, he decides that he is going to become the de facto king of Antioch and establish his own principality, and goes directly in opposition to the oath that he gave Alexios. And this is the first major turning point between the Orthodox and the Catholics regarding the Crusade. From the Orthodox perspective, the Crusaders are unloyal, they are greedy, and they're opportunistic. And you can't trust anything that they say or do. And the entire history of the Crusades is them saying one thing and then going back on their word. And so the entire trajectory of the Crusades is not about, and this is from the Orthodox perspective, the entire trajectory of the Crusades is not about the conquest of Jerusalem and Baldwin the First, king of Jerusalem. No. It's that from the beginning, what began as a Christian holy war immediately saw the Latins view the Byzantines as an enemy in and of themselves. And so they then go on to create their own principalities and states in the Levant. The Byzantines basically step back and say, all right, then you guys are on your own. You've betrayed us. You've gone back on your word. By the time of the Second Crusade, they're totally incompetent. I mean, Conrad III gets annihilated just trying to get through Anatolia. Some of them can't even get to the Levant. And this cements the Byzantine understanding. But it ends in the sacking of Constantinople. And if you don't understand this Byzantine perspective, you probably wonder, how the heck does the Fourth Crusade end with the Latin Catholics and the Venetians sacking Constantinople, when at the same time they're appealing to Constantinople to help them on their Fourth Crusade back to the Holy Land? Well, the only way you understand it is to see that by 1204, which is the sacking of Constantinople in the Fourth Crusade, from the 800s forward, from 1054 forward, from 1095 is the Council of Clermont, where Pope Urban II calls the Holy War the First Crusade. There is an animosity already built in between the Catholics and the Orthodox. And it's that sentiment, it's that jealousy. You see, here's what each side had going for them. The Catholic West had the superior warrior, the knight. The horseback knight was the superior warrior. It was the ultimate warrior in the world at the time. With their metal protective garb, the size of their horses, The weaponry, even the strength of the men. I mean, some of the Muslims commented how strong some of the Crusader men were. But here's what the Byzantines had. They had the heritage of Christianity. They had all the important relics in Constantinople. They were the seat of the highest civilization in the world at the time. And they were incredibly wealthy and opulent. And there was an arrogance of the Byzantines because the average aristocrat in Constantinople was, well-read and fluent with Plato and Aristotle and just philosophy. The type of conversation happening in Constantinople, let's face it, was more cultured and superior than other parts of Europe. And that led to a sort of arrogance of the Byzantine side to say, look, we are culture. We are civilization. We are the highest expression on the planet at the time. Those Europeans, the Western Europeans, they have great knights, but they don't have culture. And that is mocked by even the regular Orthodox people. All right, we're not even talking about inside Constantinople. We're not even talking about the emperor. We're talking about on the trip of the Crusaders through Byzantine lands. The regular people noted how uncultured, how disrespectful, how rude the Western Crusaders were compared to the Orthodox. And so realize all of this tension is ultimately built in. And so what begins as hope, the Byzantines request Western aid, it arrives. And in fact, the First Crusade actually begins in what appears to be success. The various princes who come from France and Germany and Italy to begin in the First Crusade, they actually do reconquer land from the Seljuk Turks, and that is given back to the Byzantine Empire. And as then Alexios gives them more money, more food, more opportunity, they move down into the Levant, and they eventually do take Antioch. And once they take Antioch, the Crusaders have essentially turned their back on Alexios, even though later they'll get upset that Alexios doesn't give them more money and more aid and more assistance, despite the fact that they're literally telling him, we are not going to give you, we break our oath. We lied to you. We're going to take the land whether you want it or not. And so from a Western, we never hear this perspective about the Crusades. We never hear what it's ultimately about. And so immediately, once Antioch is taken by Beaumont of Taranto, we see that they have totally different goals. The crusading Latins and the Eastern Byzantine, they have totally different goals. And betrayal is the first example in Antioch. And it's ultimately, the ultimate betrayal is the Fourth Crusade, which the Byzantines were not expecting, right? They thought that they were going to help the Venetians and the Normans and the Franks and the Germans go back and do another crusade, of which number 2 and number 3 were unsuccessful. They weren't successful. You could say the most Crusade 2 is totally unsuccessful. They accomplished nothing. Crusade 3 is Richard the Lionheart, the great warrior from England, King of England. And he was an incredible warrior, but he had no interest in aiding the Byzantines because by this point, once you're in the years 800s, the Holy Roman Empire has an immense animosity towards the Byzantine Empire because the Byzantines are the true Romans. But the Holy Roman Empire, under the Pope, wants to revalidate its Roman identity, and they hate the fact that the Byzantine Constantinople Empire is the remnant of the true Roman Empire. And that's why the Pope makes his pact with Charlemagne in the year 800 on Christmas Day. So all of this is leading into it. And so the Crusades are not a story of steady progress, but from an Orthodox perspective, a gradual unraveling. And once the Orthodox were able to retake Constantinople, after the 57 years that the Latins were able to hold it and make the Byzantines actually have an empire in Nicaea over in Anatolia, the Orthodox people, this Orthodox front of the Orthodox world is in opposition to the Catholic West. And so once you get to the Council of Florence, because another very similar thing happens, we see the pattern. The Ottoman Turks at this point surrounding Constantinople, right? This is before the fall of Constantinople in the 15th century. What do? They appeal back to the Pope again. They appeal back to the West. Guys, can we get money? We need soldiers. The Ottomans are getting ready to take Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire is getting ready to fall. and they have the Council of Florence, and there's an agreement that they're going to reunite under the Pope, right? But when these bishops get back to their Orthodox lands, they're lambasted by the Orthodox. They don't want anything to do with the Catholics. They would rather die under the Ottoman Turks and be subjugated than to live peacefully under the Pope because of all of this history that already occurred before. And that's why the Orthodox lands despised the bishops after the Council of Florence that wanted to unite with the Pope, because they said, how could you? How could you unite with them after what they've done to us? And so from the Orthodox perspective here, it's not primarily Christianity versus Islam. It's Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and Islam. And even amongst Islam, it's Sunni versus Shia, as we'll see. But the division within Christendom is actually the main emphasis here from the Orthodox perspective. And the Catholics develop a new theology, a new understanding of indulgences and penitence through a holy war. And this is why, honestly, some of the Crusaders acted in absolutely debaucherous ways, because they fully believed that whatever sins they committed, if they die in battle during the Crusades, they will be sinless, because the Pope told them that. And so, yes, some atrocities occurred. I mean, in the sacking of Constantinople, we see Latins raping Orthodox women. We see them burning down and destroying Orthodox churches. And it's something that the Orthodox world has never forgot. And so from the ultimate perspective on the Crusades, from the Byzantine vantage point, is that it's an undermining of Byzantine civilization. It's a brotherly, jealous attack and betrayal when they least expected it. And it only deepened the rift, the historical rift between the Greek East and the Latin West. So that's a little bit of my opening monologue. Let me hit some super chats real quick. Look like some people sent in some super chats. And then let me get into the video that covers the large general perspective that I just laid out. And then we'll get into more specifics, because we're going to be focusing specifically today on the First Crusade and the Fourth Crusade. Because by the Third Crusade, Byzantium has essentially turned their back, as the Crusaders have turned their back on Byzantium. And the Second Crusade, there was still an open hand from Byzantium to help the Crusaders, of which, because of the disasters that occurred in the Second Crusade, the Byzantines essentially roll their eyes and say, look how incompetent. They just throw soldiers out here and expect to win victory against these Muslims. So, smash that like, guys. Silvar Ogre became a new member. Thank you so much, brother. God bless you. Really appreciate you. Bryce throws in $2. Thank you very much. Our Serbian brother, Serbian Slav Squad, Codal crew member for 8 months, says the Crusades were an excuse to weaken, subjugate, and destroy Orthodoxy. Jokes on them. We just had to live through 500 years of Turks. Exactly. No, and that's the point that we're going to make today, is that the Crusades, from the Western perspective, you never hear about the Byzantines. You never hear about Alexios. You never hear about the betrayals and the oaths that the Crusaders made to the Byzantine emperor and what the ultimate purpose and why they were even there. You never get that side. You only get the heroic knight and the Crusader who goes to the Holy Lands and liberates the Christians from the evil Muslims, which, let's face it, there were evil Muslims. There were. But that's not what the Crusade was ultimately about. Henry throws in $1. Thank you very much. He throws in another $2. Thank you very much, Henry. 317 Raider. Oh, I know who this is. He says, Christ is risen. Truly he is risen. The Crusades were a huge stab in the back for the Byzantine Empire. Amen to that. Amen to that. And that's what my goal, the narrative arc of today's stream, is to show you why that's the case. It's to present a new narrative. The narrative is not focusing on the battles that occurred, or Baldwin of Jerusalem, or how Jerusalem was lost to Saladin and it was never reclaimed. No, the point from a Byzantine perspective is to show the animosity and the underlying goal, and even the Pope himself was in support of the weakening of the Byzantine Empire. That what we thought as a true calling of arms, as an act of, hey, we got a lot of problems, But can I get some mercenaries? Let us work together. That was originally what Alexios called for, was a unification of Christendom, even though theologically we're different. We cannot unite as a church, but as Christian brothers, let's come together and let's reconquer historical Roman Christian land from the Muslims. That was the appeal. But by the time the Crusaders get there, they feel, oh, this is an opportunity to establish papal states. This is an opportunity to carve out our own little provinces here in the Levant and allow the Pope to reign supreme over it all. Patrick throws in 10, says, went to my first Orthodox service here in Louisville at midnight for Pascha, truly life-changing for this Baptist boy. Well, Patrick, glory to God, man. I don't know what church you went to in Louisville. I know, isn't it St. Michael's? I haven't been, but I think there's a massive, beautiful Orthodox church there in Louisville. I have a friend that I know goes there. I think the parish is called St. Michael's. Correct me if I'm wrong, anybody in the chat. But that's great, man. Congratulations, and I hope you continue to go to services. The Pascha is a beautiful, beautiful celebration, especially the entire Holy Week. We talked about in the men's group over in the Logos Academy. So, congrats, Patrick. That's wonderful. Wood Floor Alchemist throws in $50. Thank you so much for the generous super chat. He says, Christ is risen. Truly, he is risen. Love you, brother. Love your content. My family just finally came home to the church after a 3-year journey out of the bear cult to Orthodox. Whoa! From bear cult to Orthodoxy. That is a journey. When he's talking about bear cult, he's talking about the supporters of Owen Benjamin, the comedian. Yeah. I'm just north of you in Goshen. Thanks for your part in that journey. Oh, Goshen, Indiana. Oh, wow. Fellow Hoosier. Wow, Wood Floor Alchemist. If you're ever in the Indianapolis area, we'll have to link up for lunch or something, man. Glory to God. And, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you and your family. The whole family converted. That's excellent, man. Glory to God. And thank you so much for that generous support. Nathaniel throws in 5, said, I said it before and I'll say it again. The Ottomans wouldn't have ever been such a problem if the Catholic hadn't sabotaged the Orthodox powers. It's true. It's true. If the Latin Crusaders actually aided the Orthodox in taking back Anatolia and these lands, history would be so different. So different. Essentially, the Catholics set the stage for Islamic conquest of the Byzantine Empire. If the Catholics didn't do what they did and actually aided, history would have been totally different. Taint Nuffum throws in 20. Thank you so much. He said, Richard Lionheart is overrated. He couldn't even take Jerusalem. Well, it's true. He didn't take Jerusalem, but he was pretty good. And he got captured by the HR. That's true. The Holy Roman Emperor on his way back. He did. That happened as well. Almost bankrupting England to pay for the ransom. Then he died in France from a random arrow with no air. That is true. I can't argue. All of that is true. I would say though, Richard Lionheart was a brave crusader, but again, he had no allegiance or sympathy for Byzantium. Right. So from an Orthodox perspective, we're kind of a world apart from Richard Lionheart, and that's the Third Crusade. But taint Nuffum, I can't really argue with anything you say. All of that is factual. And Mr. Fist throws in 20. Thank you so much, brothers. And he says, my keys cope intensifies. And then Henry throws in another 5. Thank you so much, Henry. He says, the main narrative of the Crusade should be the definitive break between East and West, not La Base Deus Volt or Manoble Muslim victims. Yeah. No, and we're going to hammer that narrative today because it's not presented enough. So, without further ado, let's watch the first video that I have for you guys. And as I said, this is a general overview of a Byzantine perspective of the entire Crusades. Then we're going to step back out. We're going to go into the study guide and we're going to get into the specifics. And you can see here, I got the First Crusades, Second Crusade, Third Crusade, Fourth Crusade, and then what the Catholics stole from Constantinople. we're not gonna be watching much from the second or the third crusade. Maybe a little bit on the second crusade, on really the fall of the Western powers, and then the fourth crusade. We'll watch a little bit of John Vatatzis, and then we'll, sadly, I mean, this is actually hard to watch as an Orthodox Christian, is what was lost in the sack of Constantinople. We're talking about some of the most precious items in all of Christianity. Even today, some of the most precious items and relics you could even imagine were stolen, some of them broken. Some of the relics, they would just break into pieces and then spread around Europe. So anyways, we're going to get into all that. But first, let's begin here, setting the stage.
In 968, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto II sent the Bishop of Cremona, Liutprand, to forge a marriage alliance with the Eastern Roman Empire. When the emissary arrived at Constantinople, he was forced to stand in the rain for hours, and then was accommodated in a crumbling castle, before he finally met Emperor Nikephoros II Phocas, who insulted and dismissed him. Liutprand was not even allowed to purchase the famous purple cloth, since it was considered too precious for barbarians.
So what's it highlighting right here? It's highlighting that even in the years 800, so here we have the Holy Roman Empire rivaling the actual Roman Empire, the Byzantines. When an emissary comes, there's already animosity, to the point that the Emperor of Byzantium left the emissary in the rain for 2 hours and gave him a small decrepit castle to stay in, and wouldn't even let him buy the imperial purple, which was so rare in the world at that time. It was incredibly valuable to have the purple robe. That's why Byzantium is always associated with the color purple.
As we can see, even before the East-West Schism and Crusades, the Byzantines were notoriously arrogant towards any people who were not their own, an attitude which was sure to sour the relations with potential military or trade partners. But the relations between the East and West were particularly complicated, as both sides saw each other as a necessary evil. Pragmatism led to compromise, but in these conditions, time and proximity brought out the worst in both parties. For centuries, Catholic and Orthodox communities had very limited contact, as both were mostly concerned with their regional enemies. But the Norman and Seljuk invasions led to a new level of desperation for the newly founded Komnenian dynasty, which opened a bridge between these worlds.
And so let me go back here just to show you on the map. So you can see this is Alexios Komnenos has already ascended to emperor of the Byzantine Empire. And Alexios is one of our good emperors, by the way. Alexios I is one of the better, I would say, top 10 of the emperors of the Byzantine Empire. So he's who's ruling Byzantium at this point. You can see his empire in Anatolia is totally taken over by the Seljuk Turks, the Principality of Rum there. And they really just have their Balkans territory and then some of these spots around the Black Sea. This is all because, again, this Battle of Manzikert, which is over here, it's on the sort of eastern section of what would be Anatolia, considered Anatolia, under Georgia. They lose that battle, and that sets the stage for all of this conquest that occurs. So the Turks basically take all of what was just a few years ago all Byzantine territory.
For the newly founded Komnenian dynasty, which opened a bridge between these worlds. Luckily for us today, the 5 major historians who characterized this era were very talented writers with unique access to the state, who covered the Crusader period extensively. Anna Komnene, the daughter of Alexios, John Kinematos, a bureaucrat and confidant of Manuel I, Nikitas Honiatis, a judge and civil servant, Michael Selos, a savant and counselor, and finally George Acropolites, a chancellor and commander. The first major challenge that Alexios Komnenos faced was the Norman invasion of Robert Guiscard in 1081, which had 3 major implications.
And this is the Boman who is going to betray Alexios. So this Norman king right here who rules this southern part of Italy, not only is he going to invade Byzantium, but he's going to be one of the Crusaders. This is in 1081, right? So this is, 16 years before the actual Crusades start. And we already see this is why the Byzantines, they'll deal with the Franks, they'll deal with the Papists, but they really don't like the Normans. They really don't like the Normans.
Following the defeat at the Battle of Dyrrhachium, the Roman manpower was severely depleted, forcing them to rely on mercenaries. As a direct result, Alexios used diplomacy and cunning to strike a deal with Venice, who agreed to act as the imperial navy in the Adriatic in return for exclusive trading rights. Additionally, Alexios bribed many Normans, who deserted and joined his army and court. The war was won with the Battle of Larissa, but suddenly the Byzantine populace found out they had more contact with Western Europe than ever before. The circumstance of the West's arrival led to the first major prejudice of the state and people towards the newcomers, that they were greedy and opportunistic. Those traits would become a staple and were repeated by virtually every Eastern chronicler. Even when describing Norman allies, the Roman court labeled them as the barbarians bearing the double-edged sword on their shoulders, a people that should not be trusted and should be seen as distinctly other. These fears were not unfounded, as the Normans, hired for their incredible martial prowess, continuously betrayed them by carving out their own domains in Anatolia.
That is the Norman prince that I told you when Alexios, and this is before he was emperor, asked for Norman help, and he was actually part of the reconquest of Anatolia. This is the guy that ends up betraying the Byzantines the first time before the Crusades and establishes his own state in Anatolia instead of fighting the Turks.
Further cementing the animosity between both parties. As for the Venetians, who arrived at the coastal cities and established their own colonies, at first some chroniclers, like Anna Comnena, were surprised at their high levels of loyalty, bravery, and economic resourcefulness. Others regarded them as poor cousins of the empire, who were not quite barbaric, but were almost as crude and ill-mannered as other Westerners. Some merchants and guild artisans quickly became envious of the Venetian success, and demanded that the Italians pay the same trade tax as the locals did. Otherwise, the Roman economy would soon become dependent on the foreigners. But it was the belief that they were inferior that made the court ignore such warnings. It is important to remember that the average denizen of Constantinople was walking amongst the marble masterpieces of the ancient world, prayed in the most beautiful churches in Christianity, filled with sacred relics. The aristocracy read Aristotle and the Iliad, and all citizens felt the protection of the massive Theodosian walls. From their perspective, everyone else was uncultured and would fade away in time. Traditional Roman warfare proved inefficient against the Seljuk threat, so Alexios used his treasury, cunning agents, and relics to attract the attention of Western Europe, which was catalyzed by the preaching of Urban II and Peter the Hermit. Over 100,000 men, women, and children entered Byzantine lands and crossed into Anatolia.
This is called the People's Crusade. So Peter the Hermit ends up leading, I'm talking women, children, men, old people, in an attempt to go back to the Holy Land. Now, they're going to get annihilated. They're going to get wiped out. But this is the first wave regarding the First Crusade. The first people to arrive is called the People's Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit.
Described by Anna as the Celts, as one might guess, are in any case an exceptionally hot-headed race and passionate, but let them once find an inducement and they become irresistible. Initially, this was a well-coordinated operation, in which the Emperor supplied various Crusader contingents as they made their way to the Holy Land. But in one crucial moment, history changed forever. Alexios was firmly in charge, but as he made his way towards the siege of Antioch, he was met by one of the Crusader leaders, who deserted and told Alexios that the situation was hopeless. It seemed that the First Crusade was over, so the army turned back. But once they arrived at Constantinople, news arrived that the Franks had captured the city and kept it for themselves. That is the way of all the barbarians. Their mouths gape wide for gifts and money, but they have no intention whatever of doing the things for which the money is offered. Envoys were sent, demanding that the Latins keep the oath they swore and return the great city to the empire. But in response, the barbarian lunatic in his frenzied rage absolutely refused to listen. He could not bear either the truth of these words or the frankness of the envoys, and immediately reacted in the Frankish way. Glorying in his own boastfulness, he babbled that he would set his throne high above the stars and threatened to bore with his spear point through the walls of Babylon. He spoke with emphasis of his might, mouthing out the word tractor, how he was undaunted, how no one could withstand him, he confidently assured the envoys that whatever happened, he would never release his grip on Antioch, that all Romans were to him nothing more than ants, the feeblest of living things. Despite the eventual success of the Crusade, it marked the moment when the West turned from a necessary evil to an existential threat, one which consumed the minds of the nobles and commoners alike until the very end of the empire. John II Komnenos had the difficult task of filling his father's shoes and restoring balance to the empire. He waged successful wars against the Turks, Crusaders, and Hungarians, but in his attempts to put the Venetians in check, he angered his greatest naval and trading partner. In 1124, he denied the privileges granted by Alexios without building a formidable navy in case the Venetians contested it. They not only did so, but also plundered the islands of Rhodes, Chios, Samos, Lesbos, and even captured Kefalonia.
So this is happening during the Second Crusade, or leading up to the Second Crusade, after the Venetians, because they had a privileged position within the Byzantine Empire and had lower taxes, and had their own quarters in Constantinople, again, a unique status within the Byzantine Empire. When the son of Alexios, John II, rescinds that unique offer that gave the Venetians privileged status, they start ransacking Byzantine islands.
Before John reaffirmed their rights and even expanded their quarter in Constantinople. By that time, however, both sides looked at each other suspiciously and wondered how they could exploit one another rather than having a mutually beneficial relationship. The final war John started saw him muster a giant force which marched towards Antioch. But along the way, the emperor went on a boar hunt in the Tarsus Mountains, where he accidentally cut himself on a poison arrow. He died a few days later, and his last act was to choose his younger son, Manuel, as his successor instead of his brother Isaac, in line with the AIMA prophecy, which claimed that the name of each successor in the empire had to align with the Greek word for blood. It was Manuel who would turn the partnership with the West to a complete dependency in his hopes to restore the Roman Empire. The third Komnenian ruler was obsessed with the Latin world and spent the rich treasury of his predecessor in an attempt to forge powerful.
So Manuel the first, he stabilizes the empire, but he's not, the Orthodox don't look incredibly fondly on him because he was very pro-Western. He was enamored with Western culture and all these different things, and extended essentially depleted the imperial treasury to paying Westerners to come and do things, or knights and that type of thing. So he does stabilize the Byzantine Empire during this period, but he ends up emptying the treasuries of the imperial coffers.
Powerful alliances. He invited numerous foreigners to his court, adopted their customs, hosted jousting tournaments, allied the papacy, ransomed Latin knights, picked Latin brides for his family, while he married Maria of Antioch. He planned the diplomatic annexation of Hungary, whose ruler Bela was renamed to Alexios to fit the prophecy after he was designated as his heir. He built a massive fleet, which he used to counter the growing Venetian monopoly by crushing their fleet in 1171 at Chios, and used it 6 years later in an attempt to reconquer Egypt, which ultimately failed. To make up for the soured Venetian relations, Manuel invited Pisan and Genoese merchants who received their own quarters. The emperor focused on the imperial external problems, while completely neglecting the domestic situation, and while he had numerous allies abroad, the majority of his nobles, clergy, and commoners hated him. In their eyes, the state favored the Western army, navy, and merchants. In the capital, Venetians and other Italians were no longer seen as threats, but enemies. They didn't contact the same enemies the state fought on the boundaries of the empire. What they saw were rich Latins who stole their jobs and carried Roman wealth back to their homeland. The colonies were under the state's protection and featured entire communities with their own Catholic churches and clergy. Despite being located in the heart of the empire, the colonies were under foreign jurisdiction, and any crimes committed against them were resolved by an Italian judge. Merchants could marry into noble families and even buy their own titles, and while they continued to be a minor player in Byzantine politics, it demonstrated a level of social mobility unattainable for the ordinary Roman citizen. William of Tyre praises Manuel, describing him as a great-souled man of incomparable energy, who relied so implicitly on the Latins' fidelity and ability that he passed over the Greeks as soft and effeminate and entrusted important affairs to the Latins alone. By the end of his reign, the treasury was empty, the church union failed, the Hungarian inheritance failed, the diplomacy with the Kievan Rus won over only Galicia, the expansion in Italy was negligible, the Egyptian invasion failed, the merchant republics felt threatened, the Pope allied with the German Emperor, who hated Byzantium, and most of all, a quarter of the army was lost during the Battle of Myriokephalon against the Sultanate of Rome. The stage was set for a massive implosion, releasing decades of pent-up pressure. Upon Manuel's death, Byzantium was left in the hands of his Latin wife, Maria of Antioch, who ruled as regent, since their son Alexios was only 11. Within 2 years, his uncle Andronikos emerged from his exile and led a popular uprising in the capital, catalyzing the hatred towards foreigners, which spilled out into one of the most brutal massacres in history. According to some estimates, more people died that day than in the Nika riots, sack of Constantinople, and fall of Constantinople combined. In the eyes of the West, this was a brutal takeover, which replaced the pro-Latin regime with a very antagonistic one.
I don't know if you guys saw, so the uncle of Alexios II creates an uprising against the Latins due to all the animosity that the local denizens are losing money, they don't have jobs, whereas these Westerners come in and they're making buku bucks from the empire, and then they're under their own jurisdiction, they're under their own legal system, and they take all that money back to Western Europe. He, as it said, potentially, there's roughly around 60,000 Latins in Constantinople during this uprising, in which tens of thousands were killed by the Orthodox to try to displace them and get them out of the capital city.
The Holy Roman Empire threatened with invasion. Hungary conquered much of the border territories, and a new Norman invasion sacked the second city of the empire in a devastating manner. 7,000 were slain, relics were destroyed, women were raped, and the invaders were seen urinating on the streets. In the words of Nikitas Honiates, "Between us and them, the greatest gulf of disagreement has been fixed, and we are separated in purpose and diametrically opposed, even though we are closely associated and frequently share the same dwelling. Their inordinate hatred for us and our excessive disagreement with them allowed for no humane feeling between us." The following years would see the empire crack, as pretender after pretender fought for the throne. Eventually, a 21-year-old pretender would make his way towards the assembling Fourth Crusade and make ridiculous promises of riches and church union if they would give him the throne. The Crusaders and Venetians accepted and accomplished the task, only to receive orders and empty threats before the pretender was assassinated. Once again, the pendulum swung as a pro-Western regime was replaced with one that used them and vowed to destroy them, which led to the 1204 sack of Constantinople, an event which some contemporaries describe as the fall of Troy. In the beginning of his description of the sack, Honiates references Solon, an ancient Athenian statesman. He reveals how Solon warned of the rise of tyranny, recognizing that it was easier to eradicate an emerging evil in the very beginning, and thus prevent it taking root, than to cut it away and destroy it after it has grown and become very strong. When Solon's protestations were ignored, he warned that the Athenians would not be able to blame the gods for their future suffering. He continues to paint a savage picture where, maddened by war and murderous in spirit, boasting terribly, barking like Cerberus and exhaling like Charon.
And that was during the Fourth Crusade, that video footage there of a Western Latin knight dragging an Orthodox girl. This is according to Western chronicles, right? So it's not even Eastern history. Western chronicles describe the knight dragging the girl by her hair and beginning to rape her in a house that he took over because the people fled. And luckily, there was 2 other crusading knights that found that abhorrent and went in there and stopped him and said, "If you don't stop, we're going to kill you right now," basically. And he stopped. But that is what was going on during the sacking.
We recommend you check out our video on what was lost during the sack to get a sense of how damaging these events were, not only to the Byzantine state, but its identity. When Nicetas fled to Nicaea, he was surprised to find out that he was shunned by its citizens, who blamed the fate of the now fallen empire on the decisions of its senate. Another chronicler, by the name of George Acropolites, recounts, It seems, O Italians, that you no longer remember our ancient harmony, but no other nations were ever as harmonious as the Greci and the Italians, and this was only to be expected, for science and learning came to the Italians from the Greci, and after that point, so that they need not use their ethnic names, a new Rome was built to complement the elder one, so that all could be called Romans after the common name of such great cities, and have the same faith and the same name for it. And just as they received that noble name from Christ, so too did they take upon themselves the national name, and everything else was common to them, the magistracies, laws, literature, city councils, law courts, piety itself, so that there was nothing that was not common to those of the elder and new Rome. But oh, how things have changed. The following 5 decades were difficult, but the new generation learned to live in the shattered remnant of Byzantium, recalling its ancient glory days, and despising what they now called the humiliated generation. The new Latin states were forced to keep almost all of the old customs, as the two were forced into an uneasy alliance against Bulgaria and other threats. Eventually, Constantinople was reconquered in 1261, but the scars of the last 2 centuries would never heal. Future Crusades bypassed Byzantium, choosing to directly sail to the Holy Lands, until the arrival of the Ottomans. Ironically, the Crusades of Nicopolis and Varna saw most of the Catholic world unite to aid the Romans, who worried more about the Latins than the Sultans. The latter crusade was on the brink of saving Constantinople before the King of Poland, Lithuania and Hungary died in battle. This momentary distraction allowed the Catholic Constantine XI to retake Athens, but only a few years later he would witness the end of the Eastern Roman Empire. Our mini-series on this
And we're going to end today's stream by watching what was taken during the sack of Constantinople. But we got some things to get through first. So that was the first little section. That was the general overview of the crusade from the Orthodox perspective. So you can see it was one of tension. It was one of betrayal. It was one of 2 groups having totally different goals and objectives, and even viewing the Crusades themselves in totally different ways. So let me now get into some more details for you guys as we move through, and we can return back to the First Crusades, because really the First Crusade is the most interesting crusade. And from the Western vantage point, it's the most successful crusade. It's the one that they actually get Jerusalem, Antioch, and then subsequently some of the other coastal cities in the Levant. So here's my study guide. This will be available up at the Logos Academy. Go to school.com/Logos Academy if anybody wants access to any of the study guides. Framing the problem, as I said, 2 civilizations within Christendom, but 2 very different worldviews. For the Latin West, they had a juridical theology, penitential warfare, and papal supremacy. This sort of defines the general characteristics of the Latins compared to the Greek East. Whereas in Constantinople, they had a sacramental healing. And this is tied with the penitential warfare, that in Orthodoxy, even these soldiers who fight for the empire, and maybe they killed Turks or whoever in a just war, they still were pulled out of the Eucharistic offering and had to go through a period before they were able to take the Eucharist again. It had to do with this sacramental healing of the soul, that the war is inevitable. It's part of our life from the Orthodox perspective, but it's not sacramental. What Pope Urban does is basically add the Holy War as a sacrament for laity and creates the Crusader as a new office for lay people. Like it's a new occupation. You can become a Crusader for the first time. And so sacramental healing for the East, symphonia, church, empire harmony, as opposed to what was going on in the West, and then suspicion towards religious violence. Thus, Crusades exposed not just political conflict, but deep theological divergence already present after the Great Schism of 1054. Byzantine appeal to defensive war, not crusade. As I said, what started the whole First Crusade? Byzantine defeat at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. 1071, one of the most humiliating defeats in Byzantine history by the Seljuk Turks, leading and allowing the conquest of Anatolia by the Seljuk Turks. This is the state of the Byzantine Empire at this point. So Emperor Alexios Komnenos seeks Western mercenaries, not a mass religious movement. That's what he sends to Pope Urban II, talking about, why don't we come together as Christian brothers and fight a common enemy in the restoration of Roman territory against the infidels, meaning the Muslims, and the Muslims growing as a military power. So the Byzantine intent is restore imperial territory, reinforce frontiers, maintain political sovereignty. Western transformation at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban reframes this into penitential pilgrimage, a war with spiritual merit, indulgences. This was already a misalignment. The West spiritualized what Byzantium saw as a pragmatic military alliance. And here are the major timeline events. So, Battle of Manzikert, 1071. 1081, the rise of Alexios Komnenos. Stabilizes empire, and then seeks Western military alliance. This leads to the First Crusade. From the Orthodox perspective, it begins hopeful. Even despite their differences, the cultural, the theological, the ethnic, the linguistic, it's hopeful. There's a hope in which they could actually come together for something better. And then they get the first fracture. So 1095, Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II calls the Crusade. Byzantine request becomes a mass religious movement. 1097, Nicaea becomes recaptured. This is where the hope is. Or the Orthodox Emperor Alexios says, okay, well, it's not easy. It's difficult to organize with the Latin Knights, but look what we just did. We're able to take back Nicaea. And that was returned back to Byzantium. Now, mind you, it's right next to Constantinople, so it makes sense why they would do that. And this was seen as, this must be the pattern that the Crusade's going to go down. Well, wait until 1098. Antioch is seized by the Crusaders, and honestly, you should watch it all, against all odds. I mean, they're right on the brink of just giving up because they've been there for so many months. And Bohemond of Taranto refuses to return the city. The same Norman that 15 years previously was attacking the southwestern part of the Byzantine Empire. And this is the first turning point. You have this, I have the little siren emoji I found. First turning point, meaning the first clear betrayal of Byzantine trust. 1099, Jerusalem is captured. Crusaders establish the Latin kingdom. Success for the West, but outside Byzantine control. Then you have the Second Crusade. And this is just total disillusionment because it accomplishes nothing. Second Crusade, Western kings march east from France and Germany. They fail disastrously in Anatolia. And for 1148, the failed siege of Damascus, turning point, meaning Western armies equal disorganized and ineffective from the Byzantine perspective, and the distrust of the Crusaders deepens. Then you have the Third Crusade, where essentially the rift between the West and the East is fairly explicit. The famous Battle of Hattin, Saladin defeats the Crusaders. Jerusalem is lost, despite the Battle of Jaffa and others, where Lionheart is able to defeat Saladin, but he's never able to reconquer Jerusalem. Once Saladin takes Jerusalem, it's never attained again. Except for this brief little period where there's like we'll get into it. There's a brief little negotiation, but it doesn't go anywhere. So collapse of Crusader strength after the Third Crusade. Richard of England, he wins some victories. Jerusalem isn't taken. It basically becomes a Western geopolitical project because they have Tyre, Acre, Antioch. They have these coastal cities. Byzantium increasingly is irrelevant in regards to the activities and objectives in the Levant. And then the Fourth Crusade, the ultimate betrayal, is 1202 to 1203, is the diversion of the Crusades. The Venetian influence and redirects the entire Fourth Crusade to Constantinople. Crusaders attack, churches desecrated, relics looted, Latin Empire established, ultimate betrayal of orthodoxy, final rupture between East and West, fully submitted. That's why there is no unification after that. And so the aftermath, the Byzantine recapture Constantinople in 1261. 57 years, the Latin Crusaders control Constantinople, forcing the Byzantines to live in Nicaea, essentially. And this meant political recovery, but spiritual and civilizational damage remains. And basically, the empire just wanes and gets smaller and smaller from that point forward. So, I'm just gonna look at the First Crusade here because that's what we're gonna get into. Is the First Crusade 1096 to 1099, broadly successful in Western terms. The Western objectives is to liberate Jerusalem, aid Eastern Christians, and gain remission of sins, penitential warfare. The Byzantine sole purpose is to recover lost Anatolian territories and use Crusaders as mercenary support due to the lack of soldiers they have. Key moments: People's Crusade destroyed before reaching Asia Minor. I'll show you that. That's Peter the Hermit and all the women, children, elderly. He took right into the heart of the Seljuk Turks. And then you have Crusaders swear oath to Alexios, but then betray him after the siege of Antioch, and then they capture Jerusalem 1099. Success, establishment of Crusader states, Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, temporary weakening of Muslim powers. The failures, Crusaders fail to return Byzantine lands, and then deepening mistrust between Latins and Greeks. From the Byzantine view, initially hopeful, ultimately disillusioned, saw Crusaders as undisciplined oath breakers and beginning a pattern where Western aid becomes Western encroachment. So that's the First Crusade. And I have a handful of myths, Western, myths about, I have 5 major myths about the Crusades that from the Orthodox perspective just don't jive. I'll get into those here in just a few, but I want to return now to the First Crusade and add some context to the Orthodox perspective that we were just highlighting in the document. So let's flip over to the First Crusade here. And this is almost a 6-hour documentary on kings and generals. If you want to see the whole kit and caboodle of the First Crusade, check this one out. It has incredible details. It's an incredible overview. We are obviously not watching 6 hours of documentary. So I'm going to move through here. This whole section's about the Battle of Manzikert, why that was so devastating for Byzantium. And then you have the rise of Alexios Komnenos, and talking about how he was able to achieve victory and basically how he becomes the emperor of Byzantium. So we're going to begin here with Pope Urban calling for...
was to the east.
Pope Urban calling for the Crusade. So we're aware of everything that happened. The Eastern Empire is needing mercenaries, and so he sends the letter to Pope Urban, and this is what unfolds afterwards.
So far, we have covered the First Crusade of Alexios Komnenos' reign as he usurped the throne of a bankrupted and exhausted Eastern Roman Empire in 1081. He fought off the Normans and Pechenegs and restored imperial authority while maintaining the balance between the powerful noble families, clergy, and commoners. And yet the biggest issue on the agenda was left unaddressed. The now firmly established Sultanate of Rum, which began as a branch of the Seljuk Empire, was no longer a vassal of the Byzantines. A year after his victory at the Battle of Livonian, Alexios launched several ambitious social and monetary reforms and crowned his son John as heir, before assembling an army to reconquer Anatolia. But before he could depart, news of a Serbian uprising reached the capital, and the emperor knew that he could not campaign in the east while the west was in open rebellion, so he set out toward Dyrrhachium. As the army moved across the Via Egnatia in 1093, Nikephoros Iachenes, the son of Romanos IV, was caught with a concealed dagger. After being tortured, the co-conspirators were revealed, and to the emperor's surprise, the list included the former empress Maria and his own brother Adrianos, who plotted to kill him. Alexios came to the realization that the empire was not stable enough to afford a large-scale, lengthy campaign against the Seljuks, and that with every idle moment, it was slipping back to the disasters he fought so desperately to avoid. Luckily, he was meticulously working on another plan. After witnessing the military prowess of the Norman knights firsthand, Alexios appealed to the courts of the West, hoping to inspire an armed pilgrimage which would reconquer the Roman lands for more than just gold. Agents spread the stories of how the Turks extorted and killed innocent pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem, how the Muslims destroyed holy sites and turned ancient churches into mosques or stables, how Christian men and women were enslaved and violated. Along with these came generous donations of not just coins, but precious artifacts, even pieces of the true cross, giving a taste of what was to come if a group of knights would take up this colossal task and act as a new kind of mercenary force. The Seljuk treatment of the many pilgrims who made their way towards Jerusalem was exaggerated, but not untrue. In contrast to the sedentary Islamic population, the nomads didn't strictly follow the Islamic laws of war, and were known for their brutal punishments and executions. The Seljuk realm was decentralized, and rogue chieftains often enacted their own justice. More importantly, Jerusalem, as well as the entire Seljuk Empire, was in a period of turmoil caused by a succession crisis with at least 4 pretenders and many other governors fighting each other. The majority of Christian Europe was illiterate and obsessed with holy relics. There were numerous sites that people believed to be sacred, and groups of people were displaying the bones of supposed saints for a few coins. And yet the most holy of sites was that of Jerusalem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, from which pilgrims would bring back scrapings of rock or dirt as proof of their journey. That very church was destroyed by the Fatimid Caliph in 1009 and rebuilt in 1048 with Byzantine resources. Fear took hold of the populace, who thought the Seljuks would do the same. In fact, many believed that Jesus would return around this time to the place of his birth. Natural occurrences, such as meteor showers and earthquakes at the time, only deepened the fears and hopes of the Christian world. For centuries, the main opposition to Islam came from the borders with that world: Iberia, Sicily, South Italy, and Byzantium. But a new movement was starting to develop within Lorraine, Burgundy, and France, one which called for a completely new type of war, a holy war. Pope Urban II himself cited the Book of Daniel, stating that God had indeed changed the times and offered a new remedy for human sin. The pagans to the north were gone, the Reconquista was yet another source of fear and hope, and the nobles were obsessed with the idea of a just war. The lords who dominated the fractured monarchies grew rich and numerous with the technological and agricultural innovations of the 11th century, and by now, most houses adopted primogeniture, which meant that the older sons inherited the domain, leaving younger sons without a purpose, often turning against each other despite the outcries of the church. Pilgrimage was one of the best ways for the Latins to repent for their sins, whether it was to Santiago de Compostela, Rome, or Jerusalem, as long as they could afford it. They knew the road and how to fight, but lacked a common goal and leader. Until this period, the papacy had little more than nominal power, but the energetic pontificates of Leo IX, Nicholas II, Alexander II, and especially Gregory VII led the papal states to vie for power and authority over the entire Catholic world. Leo IX personally led an army in 1053, as seen in our series on the Normans in Italy. In 1063, Alexander II sent a papal banner and an indulgence for those who fell in battle against the Muslims to the army preparing for the siege of Barbastro in Spain, and another one to William of Normandy as he was preparing his conquest of England. In 1073, Gregory VII proposed to lead an army to aid Constantinople, and now Urban II, who had just regained the papal seat from the anti-pope in 1093, the year the plot to kill Alexios was thwarted, was preparing to outdo them all. Pope Urban II was elected in 1088, and was one of the most prominent supporters of the Gregorian reforms, which outlined the superiority of the church over the secular rulers. Initially, he was isolated from Rome due to his clash with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, but he was energetic, well-spoken, and extremely charismatic, touring Norman Italy, gathering support everywhere he went. Determined to gain the pontificate, he even reached out to the Eastern Roman Empire, extending the friendly correspondence with Alexios, which was established by the former Pope Victor III. Even after being recognized as the Bishop of Rome in 1093, he continued his frantic expeditions across Christendom and assembled the Council of Piacenza in March of 1095, which was centered around church reform, the anti-pope, heresy, and the issue of the French king Philippe I, who married Bertrand of Montfort, despite the fact that they both had spouses of their own, for which he was excommunicated.
So we're going to skip forward. This is going to be, again, it talks more about Pope Urban. We're focusing on the Byzantine perspective. So then Pope Urban begins the call. They first responded with the People's Crusade, but then the princes begin to join the party. And so we're going to skip forward here to the Prince's Crusade. If you want to learn more about the People's Crusade, go ahead. It has to do with Peter the Hermit and all these regular people he was going to take on this pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and they all get annihilated. So we're going to focus on the next portion here. This is the Prince's Crusade. So here are the actual princes of Western Europe being called up for the crusade.
The so-called Peasant Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit, left a bitter taste in Emperor Alexios' mouth, but he was still determined to carry out his plan. Dyrrhachium was designated as the rendezvous point, where Byzantine officials and interpreters, along with large stockpiles of provisions and gifts, awaited the army, probably the largest since the days of the United Roman Empire. To quote the chronicler and participant of the Prince's Crusade, Fulcher of Chartres, "Whoever heard of such a mixture of languages in one army? There were Franks, Flemings, Frisians, Gauls, Allobroges, Lotharingians, Alemanni, Bavarians, Normans, English, Scots, Aquitanians, Italians, Dacians, Apulians, Iberians, Bretons, Greeks, and Armenians. If any Breton or Teuton wished to question me, I could neither reply nor understand." The earliest group was that of Hugh, Count of Vermandois, brother of the excommunicated French king, and one of the two actual princes in this Prince's Crusade. In February 1096, he led a council in Paris, discussing the logistics and goals of the expedition, which he intended to lead. Coincidentally, a lunar eclipse occurred during the negotiations, and thousands of Parisians observed as the moon became blood red. During the next several months, commoners and nobles alike sold off their possessions as they needed the currency to buy provisions along the way, which led to a rare case of mass deflation due to the shortage of hard coinage. The group headed out towards Constantinople at the agreed-upon date of August 15th, and along the way was joined by the remnants of Count Emico's force, most of whom were knights. Upon reaching Bari in October, Hugh sent a few envoys to Dyrrhachium with the words, "Be it known to you, Duke, that our Lord Hugh is almost here. He brings with him from Rome the golden standard of St. Peter. Understand, moreover, that he is the supreme commander of the Frankish army. See to it, then, that he is accorded a reception worthy of his rank, and yourself prepare to meet him." Unfortunately for Hugh, however, another natural disaster intervened, as most of his fleet was sunk during the treacherous crossing of the Adriatic. The prince himself was found on the coast near Dyrrhachium, shipwrecked and without the majority of his army and supplies. The remnants were greeted warmly, outfitted and fed, before being escorted to Alexios by Admiral Manuel Vutamitis. The second group was led by Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lorraine, who spent the last 20 years of his life fighting for the Holy Roman Emperor against the papacy.
And we're going to be talking about some of these figures here right after this. So before we get into the siege of Antioch, Godfrey is actually one of the better crusaders. I would say Raymond of Toulouse is probably the best from the Byzantine perspective. He was one of the rational voices that wanted to give the territory back to the Byzantines and uphold his oath. He felt conflicted, and his conscience plagued him for the fact that they were essentially betraying Alexios despite everything that he gave them for their crusading mission. And Godfrey, he was a pretty pious guy, honest guy. Again, does his interest align with Alexios or the Byzantine Empire? Absolutely not. But out of all the figures, I would say Raymond of Toulouse and then Godfrey of Bouillon is probably the two figures that we could say those were pretty quality men. Maybe we don't agree with what their objective was, but they were at least honest people.
And defending his own lands from a coalition of claimants. Despite tracing his ancestry to Charlemagne himself, his titles were not hereditary, which meant that his position was very unstable. So when the preachings of Urban and Peter reached him, Godfrey answered the call with great enthusiasm. He sold off most of his estates, mortgaged his great castle of Bouillon to the Bishop of Liege, and extorted many Jewish citizens in order to equip a formidable army, which included his brother Baldwin and many knights and nobles. In order to avoid the papacy, his second army decided to pass the same land.
And that is the Baldwin who will become the king of Jerusalem. So his brother Baldwin is Baldwin the First of Jerusalem.
Route taken by the People's Crusade via Hungary. In early October, King Coloman was given Godfrey's brother as hostage in case the Crusaders decided to raid the countryside, and convinced him to grant the Crusaders passage after he pledged that there would be no raiding. There were no accidents along the way, thanks to the high discipline and warning that anyone who defied Godfrey would be killed, and by November he was reunited with his brother and entered the sacked city of Belgrade. By the time they reached Niš, the Crusaders met up with their Byzantine escorts, who guaranteed that the army would be well fed along the way, with each city generously...
I didn't know if anybody else picked that one up. It gets even worse in the Second Crusade. But yeah, Godfrey, he needed money, so he just raided Jewish savings.
Handing out grain, wine, oil, and meat. Some of the nobles were so impressed by this warm welcome that they raced to Constantinople, hoping to get more gifts, at which point they heard a rumor that the French prince was imprisoned. On December 12th, Godfrey halted at Salimbria, and what had until this point been an unprecedented peaceful movement turned to raiding and looting of the countryside after the demand to release Hugh was rejected. Alexios sent 2 Franks in his service to calm things down, and by December 23rd, the army made camp outside Constantinople along the Golden Horn, where Hugh awaited Godfrey to assure him that the rumor was false. The Lotharingians were puzzled and further infuriated as some survivors of the Battle of Civitot blamed Alexios for the disaster, and as a result, Godfrey refused his invitation to meet the emperor personally. Alexios responded by closing his markets to the Crusaders, and hostilities were resumed. Demands, insults, scare tactics, and a short-lived Christmas truce ensued, before Alexios sent several ships filled with Pecheneg archers to harass the Frankish camp, while Godfrey marched towards Constantinople, aiming to assault it. His brother Baldwin led 500 soldiers, who attempted to set the city gate on fire. Both sides sustained heavy casualties, but eventually the attack was repulsed. After 6 more days of plundering the countryside, the Crusaders were shocked when an imperial envoy arrived and announced that Alexios was ready to make peace and deliver his own son and heir, John, as a hostage. With this guarantee, Godfrey entered the city with a small entourage, where instead of a vengeful enemy, he met a generous host. "I have heard about you," Alexios told him, "that you are a very powerful knight and prince in your land, and a very wise man and completely honest. Because of this, I am taking you as my adopted son, and I am putting everything I possess in your power, so that my empire and land can be freed and saved through you from the present and future multitudes." In return for numerous gifts, Godfrey swore an oath that he would not harm imperial subjects and return any land taken conquered from the Turks to Alexios. Some sources misunderstand this oath as one of vassalage, but this was a masterful use of a familiar custom for a completely different purpose. Mercenaries in the service of Byzantium were forced to make a similar oath, but were given titles and land in return. In this case, Alexios became the supreme commander of the expedition, offering gifts instead of land. When he returned to his camp, Godfrey ordered his men to keep the peace and began boarding Byzantine ships, who transported him across the Bosphorus along with Hugh and Peter the Hermit. The third Crusader force was that of Bohemond, who had been disinherited by his father, Robert Guiscard, in favor of his younger half-brother, Roger Borsa, leaving Bohemond with just Taranto and Bari.
And Beaumont, this gentleman right here, he is the one who's going to claim ownership of Antioch. He is the one that is the most explicit betrayer of Alexios. He is the one 15 years earlier who is ransacking that coastal area there of the Eastern Roman Empire. So this is a gentleman who, again, do we support Godfrey per se? No, but he was more honest than Beaumont. Beaumont was not a good guy. He was all about, again, he was dispossessed of some of his heritage by his father. And so his whole thing was about gaining wealth, fame, and status. That's why he's on the crusade.
In 1096, he was helping his uncle lay siege to Amalfi when he heard that a massive army was making its way to the Holy Land with crosses on their shoulders. With little to lose, Bohemond prepared to invade Byzantium once more and tore off his expensive garment and had it cut into crosses for his men. Many warriors stepped forward under the pretext of this religious movement, and 500 knights, along with many footmen, abandoned the siege to travel east. The experienced commander ordered that his men land at multiple points across the Adriatic coastline, before meeting up in the city of Valona on November 1st. They were instructed to not plunder the countryside and claim only as much food as they needed, but as they arrived at their former base of operations in Castoria, the garrison refused to share their supplies, which led to another series of widespread looting, during which an entire community of Paulicians was eradicated at Pelagonia. As the army reached the Via Egnatia, they were met by a group of Pecheneg mounted archers, who harassed them with the tried and tested nomadic tactics. The Crusaders prevailed, and several Pechenegs were captured, but as soon as Bohemond found out they were carrying out imperial orders, he let them go. Eventually, a high official met with the Normans, who smoothed things over and provided them with supplies. At the same time, Bohemond attempted to make contact with Godfrey and offered a joint attack against the Empire, but his message arrived just as he was making peace with Alexios. Bohemond had some of the best soldiers in the world, but his contingent was small, so he decided to enter Constantinople as a friend. Upon meeting his old rival, Alexios once again showed him the best hospitality he could hope for. During a feast, Bohemond was offered both cooked and raw meat in case he feared that it was poisoned. The Norman decided to pick the latter and prepared the meal himself. Later, he began negotiating with Alexios in his native Greek language and suggested that he should become Domestikos of the East, or chief commander of the eastern lands. The request was denied, and instead, he was promised ownership of any lands east of Antioch, as well as being designated as an imperial agent. After agreeing and swearing the same oath as other crusaders, Bohemond returned to his quarters, which were filled with precious objects, coins, and silk. Not everyone in Bohemond's army was happy about this. His nephew, Tancred, had no intentions to play sophisticated mind games, and instead crossed the Bosphorus with the bulk of the Norman forces. That same day, the third and by far the largest Crusader army, making up half of the total force, arrived at Constantinople. Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, was extremely rich and more powerful than the French king himself, having recently inherited Provence. By his marriage with Elvira of Aragon, he was connected with the royal houses of Iberia and fought several wars there. He was the only Crusade leader who personally discussed the project with Pope Urban and was fully committed to it. He brought his wife and heir, as well as several noblemen from southern France, but his most influential follower was the spiritual leader and first Crusader bishop, Adhemar of Le Puy.
It is this Raymond of Toulouse that I said is probably the most honorable figure of the First Crusade, especially from the Orthodox perspective. He was a trustworthy person. Now, as I said, these are Catholics. They have a totally different objective. They have a totally different perspective of what their purpose is there. They view their alliance with Byzantium as a sort of temporary thing because their goal is, as will become, to establish their own papal states, if you will. At least their own chieftains that are... The Pope himself is ultimately the sole authority.
Raymond had no intention to return to France, and it took a long time to put his affairs in order, which delayed his departure. Additionally, instead of taking the suggested route via Bari or the popular land route, he decided to travel via the Adriatic coast through the harsh roads of Dalmatia in the winter, where his army was harassed by Slavic tribes. Eventually, the army made its way to Dyrrhachium and resupplied, but they became wary of the Pecheneg parties sent to watch their actions. It was very difficult to control such a vast force, and before long, hostilities broke out. Several barons were killed during hit-and-run attacks, and Bishop Adhemar was captured by several Pechenegs who were about to kill him when one of them pointed out who he was and fled. Upon reaching Thessaloniki, the bishop and other wounded men were left to receive proper treatment, while the rest of the force marched and reached Rodosto. The envoys from the capital invited Raymond to an audience with Alexios, where he could meet up with the other Crusade leaders. Fearing that the leadership of the Crusade was slipping from his hands, he raced towards Constantinople, leaving behind a leaderless army, which naturally began pillaging the countryside. Raymond was received as well as the other leaders, but when he was asked to swear an oath, recognizing Alexios as the overall commander, and told he could take no land for himself, he was outraged. Bohemond approached him and tried to act as a mediator, but after things went sour, he pledged that if Raymond would go to war with Alexios, the Normans would stand with Byzantium. Once again, Alexios stepped challenge by waiting for Bohemond to leave and assuring Raymond that the Normans were the real enemy and that the two should stand together in case they betrayed the cause. Finally, on April 26th, Raymond swore a modified oath of non-aggression and joined the rest of the party on the other side of the Bosphorus. The last Crusader army was a combined force of 3 contingents. Robert, Duke of Normandy, was the son of William the Conqueror and was very experienced in warfare as a result of waging a war against him and his brothers after a terrible falling out over a prank. After his defeat at the hands of his own son, William only allowed him to inherit Normandy, despite being his firstborn, while his other son received England. Naturally, civil war ensued, and Robert lost, causing many of his barons to desert him. So when the call to crusade arrived, Robert was more than willing to join, especially since his grandfather died on his way to Jerusalem. So he ceded temporary control over Normandy in return for 10,000 marks of silver. His cousin, Robert Count of Flanders, also had a father who made the pilgrimage in 1089 and agreed to send Alexios 500 Flemish warriors. After Robert received a personal letter from Urban II, he was more than willing to join. Stephen of Blois, on the other hand, was not moved by the Pope, but as the husband of Adela, daughter of William the Conqueror, who made the decisions in the household, he was bound to her will, and when she wanted him to go, he agreed and left her in charge of his rich lands. The combined force of these 3 main leaders crossed the Alps and met with the Pope in Lucca, who gave them his blessings before they reached Bari. Robert of Flanders immediately crossed and had a smooth and uneventful journey all the way to Constantinople, except for losing one of his vassals, who fought a naval battle against the Byzantine fleet after he tried to sail further south from the agreed-upon route. The other 2 leaders, on the other hand, decided to wait until the following spring, which led to a mass desertion as men sold their bows to make it back home. Eventually, Robert of Normandy and Stephen of Blois made it to Constantinople and were delighted by the warm welcome, the latter writing back to his wife, "Your father, my love, gave me many great presents, but he was almost nothing in comparison with this man." The combined Crusader force was assembled at Civitot, which was fully stocked with supplies and constantly receiving more goods from the Byzantine merchants, which were sold at a fixed and fair price by the state. When we factor in the losses sustained along the way to Constantinople due to starvation, skirmishes, disease, shipwreck.
Okay, so now all of the first Crusader knights have crossed the Bosphorus, right? They've already moved from their lands, mostly as we saw France, and even Norman Italy, southern Italy, and Beaumont, that they have now crossed. Alexios has treated them well. He has given them provisions. He's given them, feasts, money, weaponry, horses, all of that stuff. He has given them what they need. They are now in Anatolia, and they are facing the Seljuk Turks. They are again, you see here in Nicaea, these little green flags. These are the Sultanate of Rome. And so now it begins, and there is a success, as I'll show you here in just a few, and that they are able to capture parts of Anatolia. I'll show you that in just a moment here. But let us go back to the study guide real quick so I can reintroduce all the figures that you just met, okay? Because it's important to have a sort of mental repertoire of who it is that we're talking about here. So let's move forward. We're going to skip the second and the third and all the different crusades here. I have a little overview. We can go back over those later if you guys want. Here is an introduction to the Latin figures, right? So who were the Crusaders? And I wrote this based off what I would see as from the Byzantine perspective. So Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman. He was a Norman prince, son of Robert, again, who took his heritage lands that was supposed to be given and gave them to his younger brother, which he was angry about. But part of a lineage that had already fought Byzantium, because you know that southern Italy has an Orthodox history. So that's why he was able to speak Greek. I don't know if you picked that up in the video, but Bohemond was able to speak Greek. He swore an oath to Alexios and then captured Antioch in 1098 and refused to give it back. So from the Byzantine perspective, deeply negative, archetypal of Latin duplicity, and confirms fear that Crusaders might convert aid into conquest, which is exactly what he did. Now here is Raymond of Toulouse, the guy that's the wealthiest. He's actually wealthier than the King of France, incredibly wealthy, has the largest Crusader force, and I described him as a sort of principled counterweight. Senior, wealthy, noble, one of the most respected leaders of the Crusade. He supported cooperation with Byzantium, even though he was the one that was reluctant to take the oath with Alexios. He opposed Bohemond's claim of Antioch and did not establish as aggressive a personal domain as some of the other Crusaders. Relatively honorable and reliable. Again, relatively from the Byzantine perspective, the entire First Crusade is a betrayal ultimately. And seen as more aligned with oath-bound conduct, often singled out as the closest thing to a trustworthy Latin prince. And then we had Godfrey of Bouillon, sincere but distant, pious knight, Frankish noble, became the ruler of Jerusalem, though avoided the title king, played a role in the capturing of Jerusalem and styled himself as a humble servant of Christ. Byzantine perspective, he was personally pious. That's why he didn't want to be referred to as a king, even though he took over Jerusalem, not oriented toward Byzantine political aims whatsoever. So that's why I kept saying he was a pious, kind of honorable guy, but their goals are not in overlap or consistent with Byzantium. Part of the movement increasingly independent and imperial authority. And then we have Baldwin, his brother. So that's Godfrey's brother here. He becomes the king of Jerusalem. So Godfrey, brother of Godfrey, first crowned king of Jerusalem, consolidated the Latin kingdom in Jerusalem and expanded and institutionalized the Crusader rule. Byzantine perspective, not seen as treacherous in the way of Bohemond, but represents something more significant, a rival kingdom. So the permanent establishment of a Latin Christian political order in traditionally Eastern Christian lands. He's viewed as effective and pragmatic, yet fundamentally displacing Byzantine Christian structures and erecting a sort of Catholic supremacy in the Holy Land. So that is the First Crusader Knights. We'll get into some of these other guys later, but one of the things that I wanted to share with you guys is before we watch the Siege of Antioch, and now we have a perspective of who these people are and what their objective is, we're going to watch their success in Anatolia, and then we're going to see the Siege of Antioch, the first ultimate betrayal, right? But here are 5 major myths of the Crusades. Myths that you hear in the West, but are false from an Eastern Orthodox perspective. Number 1, the Crusades were a unified Christian effort. You see, you get this sort of repackaging of what unfolded in the West, even when we were kids or when you're, generally you learn about the Crusades, it's the Christians against the Muslims. But as we've already highlighted, not really. Not really. The Crusades reveal not unity, but deep theological and structural division within Christendom. From the Byzantine standpoint, the problem begins immediately. Empire operates under a model of symphonia, right? That's how the East works. Church and emperor together in harmony. But in the Latin West, it centers authority in the papacy. And as we saw, even the Pope is leading battles against the Normans in southern Italy. He's clearly a political figure, deciding the fate of Holy Roman emperors and kings and princes all throughout Europe. There is no shared understanding of authority between East and West, who is in command between East and West, or the purpose between East and West. When Alexios requested it, he expects subordinate military assistance. What arrives is an independent movement with its own leadership and theology. Theology that they are going to be freed from all their sin by fighting these crusades in the Holy Lands. A new understanding of penitence. A new understanding of what it means of this just holy war and what it means to expand the property and domain of the papacy. So then the tension becomes inevitable and very explicit right from the get-go. Oaths sworn, but they're kept very loosely, as we saw. And ironically, it's Raymond, who is reluctant to do the oath, that actually upholds it, the wealthy man from France. The Crusaders act autonomously, as we'll see, even amongst the Crusades, and the main division is between Raymond of Toulouse and Beaumont of Toronto. They clearly, once the Crusade starts, become on opposite sides, and even amongst the Crusaders, very interesting interpretation and goals, and they're always in conflict with each other. In fact, even spiritually, there's conflict because it's Peter Bartholomew who claims to have found the lance. This is a huge point during the siege of Antioch. He tells the Crusaders, Raymond and his soldiers, Raymond of Toulouse, to start digging in the ground, that he had this vision that the spear that stabbed Christ during the crucifixion was buried under the ground. This guy, Peter Bartholomew, convinces the Crusaders, start digging. They did happen to find a spearhead. And this gives great rejuvenation to the Crusaders, who are struggling with the heat, lack of water, finding enough food, the constant harassment from the Muslims, and they believe that this is a sign from God. But the Artemor, the Catholic priest or bishop that we saw accompanying Raymond of Toulouse, he doesn't believe it. He thinks this is totally fake. And we'll see how that actually comes back during the siege of Antioch. So my point is that even amongst the Crusaders, they had like competing spiritual claims. Some were questioning whether this spearhead was actually the lance that pierced Christ. But because the average knight, the average Crusader, needed that to be true, because they are running straight into battle to their ultimate doom many of the time, this was a huge galvanizing miracle for the Crusaders. Now, was it truly the lance that was stuck in the side of Christ? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But for the Crusaders, it was a monumental event. So my point is, look at already the tension amongst the Crusaders. We saw the different languages. There was no language that unified the Crusaders. In one company, there could be 5, 10, 15 different languages spoken. So how do you coordinate with people like that? That's one of the problems that the Crusaders faced. And then rival claims over conquered territory. We'll see that the Crusaders will begin to battle each other at points for territory that they claimed. So the Crusades did not express Christian unity, as the West tries to tell you. They exposed that unity had already broken down at that point in history. And this last sort of offering by Alexios to sort of come together against a common enemy, the Seljuk Turks, turns into the Catholics betraying the Orthodox and taking their land. Myth 2. The Crusades were launched to defend Eastern Christians, right? The pilgrims that were going to the Holy Land and being killed by the Muslims, which was happening. But the Crusades began with a legitimate Byzantine need to quickly diverge from that purpose. Yes, Byzantium was under a real threat after the Battle of Manzikert, and yes, assistance was requested, but the empire wanted controlled forces integrated into an imperial strategy focused on restoring Anatolia. Instead, what they got was a mass religious movement filled with a theological desire and a full belief in a penitence through death during the crusade. The sole focus for the Crusaders was Jerusalem, even while taking their oath with Alexios and what he said was the mission. They already knew the goal was to get to Jerusalem, and they're driven by its own spiritual motivation. So the result, Byzantine priorities were totally sidelined after the first conquest in Anatolia. The Crusader states formed independently, and aid transformed into parallel ambition. And so the Crusaders did not remain a mission to defend Byzantium. They became something Byzantium could no longer control, even though they're the ones that gave them the food, the weaponry, and much of the money to at least get it started. Now, again, these princes and these kings were very, very wealthy, so they had their own money and they had their own resources, but the Byzantine Empire dramatically helped their efforts. Myth number 3 of the Crusades is that the Crusaders were liberators of Christian lands, Roman Orthodox Christian lands. From the Byzantine view, Crusaders often became rival rulers, not restorers. Byzantium saw recovered lands as Roman imperial territory. Crusaders often saw them as prizes of conquest. The most important example, as we'll see momentarily, is Antioch in 1098, is taken and not returned. A Latin principality is established. The kingdom of Jerusalem emerges under figures like Baldwin, and Eastern Christian structures are displaced or subordinated. So instead of restoring Byzantine Christian territory, it introduced a Latin ecclesiastical hierarchy, created new political systems, and marginalized local Orthodox Christians due to their sort of Catholic supremacy. They viewed them as secondary Christians. From the Orthodox perspective, the Crusaders did not simply liberate, their goal was to replace. Myth number 4 of the Crusades that you hear in the West, that the Crusades were morally justified as holy war. The idea of a holy war was spiritually redemptive is largely foreign to traditional Orthodox theology. In Byzantium, war is sometimes necessary, but always tragic. It's part, again, it's viewed theologically as part of the fall of humanity. That's why we have to go to war. That's why we have to kill people in battle. But it's always tragic, and people always have to have a period of penance before they can take the Eucharist again. So killing, even in war, as I said, require penance. The goal is restoration of order, not spiritual merit. In the Latin West, during the Crusades, war becomes penitential. Fighting can remit the sins, and participation becomes a spiritual act. This creates a fundamental theological divide. For Orthodox, war is a tragic necessity. For the Catholics, war is a sacred act. Repentance after violence in the East, and violence as repentance in the West. Restraint, military restraint, is a virtue in the East. Religious mobilization and conquering is a virtue in the West. The Crusades were not just military campaigns. They represented a new and controversial theology of war. And number 5, the last myth so common to the West that is false from the Eastern perspective, is the Crusades were a success for Christianity. The opposite is true. Even where Crusaders achieved short-term victories, the long-term outcome was devastating for the Christian East. The decisive event is the Fourth Crusade. A Christian army attacks the capital of Eastern Christianity without them knowing that is what they're going to do. They were already aiding in some aspects regarding the crusade. Churches are desecrated, relics are looted, and the Latin Empire replaces Byzantine rule. From this point forward, Byzantium is permanently weakened. East-West relations totally collapse. There's no repairing it. And the empire becomes more vulnerable to later Ottoman conquests, which is essentially what happens. Once Michael Palaiologos is able to retake Constantinople in 1261, the history of Byzantium is just a slow waning and progressive dwindling of its territories until the only thing that exists are islands and the city of Constantinople. And so while the West may point to Jerusalem and victory in 1099, or temporary Crusader states in Acre and Tyre or Antioch, all of that was lost. All that money, all that effort, all that human capital was lost to the West anyways. So from their perspective, the Crusades are an ultimate loss. It's an L for the Latin West, and it's an L for the Christian East, who was the bulwark against the Muslims in the first place. And so what happened, what ultimately unfolded after the Crusades, is an absolute weakening of all Christendom, but most specifically Eastern Christendom, the Byzantine, Roman, Orthodox Empire. And so the Orthodox memory centers on 1204 as a catastrophe and a betrayal. What appeared as success in the West was experienced as loss, trauma, and decline in the East. And so those are 5 myths that you'll hear Western chronicles or people that are promoting the idea of the Crusades, but from the Eastern perspective has very, very different vantage point. So next is, let's get back to our video now in the First Crusade. We've introduced some of these people. You now should be a little bit more familiar with who they are. And we're going to jump to, as you can see here, the Latin flags here, the Latins beginning to conquer aspects or territory in Anatolia on behalf of Alexios and in conjunction with Rome, like the Byzantine Roman military. So it's not like the Latin, they're just doing it by themselves. But here, let's jump into this.
But the man who was celebrated the most was Boemor of Taranto, who rallied his men to stand their ground and fight. It was his courage and leadership that prevented another massacre. It didn't take long before supernatural elements were infused into the events. Seljuk deserters swore that they had seen 2 horsemen with shimmering weapons and of wondrous appearance riding ahead of our army, menacing the enemy such that they allowed them no opportunity for fighting. Christian chroniclers later wrote that God sent 3 saints, George, Demetrius and Theodore, traditionally connected with the Orthodox Church, to save the Crusaders from doom. When the army broke camp on July 4th, they observed that the road was littered with dead horses and Seljuks, which they took as evidence of the saints charging after the routed enemy. The further the army moved away from Constantinople, the more biblical elements were infused into their beliefs and actions, the boundaries between both worlds slowly evaporating. News quickly reached Alexios, who immediately sent out his forces against Chaka. One army moved towards Abydos, while the main force marched up the Meander Valley. At the same time, the Byzantine navy sailed directly towards Smyrna, with Chaka's daughter on board as a gesture of good faith. Unbeknownst to the Byzantines, Chaka had recently fled his capital to meet up with Kilij Arslan, who personally executed him because of a growing mistrust, further destabilizing Western Anatolia. As in every other city, the Seljuks were a minority and couldn't hope to hold out, so they surrendered and a new governor was installed. As one of his first decisions, the new governor summoned a local nomad who was accused of a crime. Fearing for his own life, the desperate man grabbed a knife and stabbed the governor, which led to widespread violence as the sailors still stationed in the city massacred the local populace. Ducas had already moved on to his next target, the city of Ephesus, but when news arrived of what had just occurred at Smyrna, the Seljuks rode out and decided to meet the Romans in open battle. Both sides sustained heavy casualties, but eventually Ducas prevailed and took the city with no resistance. Leaderless, defeated, and surrounded by rebellious citizens, the Seljuks were fully aware of the severity of their situation, and city after city surrendered to Alexios. Sardis and Philadelphia quickly followed, but one particularly interesting case was that of Laodicea, where according to the Alexiad, Ducas accepted the surrender of the garrison and left it in the hands of the deserters. Based on this, we can conclude that he was short on men who could garrison the nearby fortresses, and that some nomads, including noble families, had adopted a sedentary lifestyle and chose to stay in their newfound homes and serve under Alexios. By the end of 1097, the emperor signed a truce with Kilij Arslan, having regained most of Anatolia, fulfilling the dream of his generation. But the campaign was far from over, and it didn't take long for the high morale of the Crusaders to evaporate as they made their way across the plateau. Tatikios led the crossing, which took place in mid-July, with temperatures reaching over 30 degrees Celsius. There were no major rivers, and to make matters worse, Kilij Arslan adopted a scorched earth policy, stripping the land of any supplies and burning down useful structures. A week into this tumultuous path, a stream was found, and thousands sprinted towards it. Many drank too much and suffocated, while others were trampled. The first major casualty of this expedition were the horses, a symbol of status and one of the greatest strengths of the Latin army. Western horses were larger than their eastern counterparts and demanded between 30 to 40 liters of water per day. Thousands of pack animals and hunting dogs also died, which meant that the pace at which the army could move was further slowed down. This was the sacrifice the army had to make, according to the Roman High Command, which decided to take the southern route instead of the usual one through Ankara, without even stopping at Amorium. The risky move tricked the Seljuks into thinking that the army was not heading towards Antioch, and would divert back to the coast at any moment. Coupled with their recent victory, this meant that the Crusaders were unopposed, and didn't have to worry about ambushes and hit-and-run tactics. By August, the coalition made it to Antioch in Pisidia and resupplied, but by this point, thousands of soldiers perished. The horses, mules, hunting dogs and falcons were lost, and 2 of the major leaders were on the brink of death. Rimor was severely ill and didn't expect to recover, while Godfrey was badly mauled by a bear in a recent hunt. The next stop was Iconium, a formidable but abandoned fortress, in which the army was warmly welcomed by its Roman population. At Heraclea, there was finally a hint of resistance as the Turkic riders set an ambush, but after a short skirmish, they fled the battle. The impact of Dorylaeum was so severe that nobody dared to stand against the knights for long. Instead of making for Cilicia, the army moved north towards Caesarea, then took a month crossing the Taurus Mountains, where the temperatures would drop severely, testing the constitution of the Franks, who were used to a very different climate. The roads were so steep that many knights decided to sell their weapons and armor. Whether this was a good plan or not, it solidifies the idea that even at this point, the shots were called by Alexios and his generals. As the troops advanced, Tatikios and his men rushed forward and liberated any strongholds, urging the citizens to ready their goods for the oncoming Crusaders and not to stir any trouble. In the absence of Seljuk authority, Roman and Armenian governors shifted their allegiance towards Constantinople, a step which was essential in case the siege of Antioch was prolonged and supplies were needed to support it. In November 1097, Anselm of Ribemont writes that the army held 200 fortresses and cities, while Stefan of Blois' account mentions 165. It is safe to assume that most of Anatolia was reconquered for the Komnenian dynasty.
So that was the success in Anatolia. You can see that about half of it is reclaimed by the Byzantine emperor, and the Battle of Delorium was a success. It showed how fearsome the Latin knights were. Again, they had bigger horses, they had better armor, and as I said, sometimes noted that the men seemed stronger. Some of the Muslims described the fearsome of them as warriors, and that is what the West had going for them at the time. We're going to move forward here with the Siege of Antioch. Now, it takes forever for the Siege of Antioch to actually become successful. So we're not going to watch the whole thing because it's like 30 minutes long. But we'll move forward here in the discussion to see how they began to claim these territories and leading up to the betrayal. Because after they claim Antioch and we see the betrayal, we'll move on to a new portion of the stream.
Ripped into pieces. Baldwin immediately jumped on the opportunity and established an iron grip over the city, which would become the base of the future County of Edessa, the first Crusader state, carved out with just 100 men and questionable morality. Meanwhile, the main body of the Crusader army took Marash on October 10th of 1097 and prepared to attack Antioch. At its peak, it was the third city of the Roman Empire, but its role in the region was now diminished due to the rise of neighboring Aleppo and Damascus. The Latins could have taken Jerusalem without it, but if they wanted to keep it, they needed this strategic target, which had immense value to all Christians. Luckily for them, those same cities were now fighting for dominance, while Antioch stood alone in the backdrop of the fragmented Seljuk Empire. Ruled by its ambitious and very capable Turkoman named Yankisian, who struggled to preserve his domain amidst civil war, pockets of Shiite Arabs, numerous Christian subjects, and now an impending zealous army with quite the reputation. But now, let's look at what he had going for him. A very capable Seljuk garrison of 5,000 men alongside 800 soldiers, incredibly well-built walls, 20...
Okay, we're going to continue to move forward here. We got so much to get through, so we're going to focus on the point in which the Crusaders actually take Antioch.
Back at the camp, the Crusaders held out against another sally attempt from the garrison. Winter subsided, and seeing the Norman knights returning lifted the spirits of the besiegers, who once again believed that God was on their side. This triumphal march from the Battle of the Iron Bridge was also witnessed by an unlikely emissary. Nor could anyone...
Okay, so here is the actual winning of the siege. The siege goes on for months and months and months. The Byzantine end up leaving the Latins in charge. That's why they're able to claim Antioch as their own. As it said, all the streets of the city on every side were full of corpses. This has to do with them actually taking Antioch. And mind you, this is what's so incredible about the siege of Antioch is there is a Muslim horde that is on their way to destroy the siege. So you have all these Latin knights and soldiers outside of the gates of the walls of Antioch, the gates of Antioch. And they know they basically have 2 to 3 days until they're going to be annihilated because thousands more Muslims are getting ready to come. So they either need to pack up and leave, or they need to get Antioch now. They end up finding a way in and are able to take Antioch, and the former leader, the Muslim leader, locks himself in the citadel. That's all the Muslims have left.
Anyone walk along the narrow paths of the city except over the corpses of the dead. The siege was over, but the attack on the citadel failed, leaving an isolated pocket of defenders with access to the Iron Gate. As for Yagisian, he managed to avoid the slaughter and evacuate from the city, only to be caught by some local Armenians who delivered his head to the Crusaders for a price. However, the Latins soon discovered that the horses in the garrison were unsuited for their style of warfare, and the supplies were dwindling. The very next day, on June 5th, 1098, they looked over the ramparts and saw the army of Keboga. Yet again, utter ruin was avoided, but yet again they had to face an impossible challenge. A knight named Roger of Barneville charged at the host with 15 of his men, only to be lured by a feigned retreat and wiped out. The besiegers now became the besieged, and they tried to fortify the city, while Keboga attacked the only fortification the Crusaders didn't abandon, La Marie. Wave after wave was repelled, but it was too much for the makeshift fort, and it was abandoned and destroyed a few days later. Now both sides were fixated on the citadel. Keboga replaced Yagisian's son with one of his own men, showing his true intentions regarding Antioch, and prepared his forces, which could trickle into the city via the Iron Gate, while the Crusaders made camp against it, knowing that they would never be secure if it was in enemy hands. Outnumbered 2 to 1, the Latins made another audacious attack by charging at the Muslims from a southern postern gate and catching them by surprise. While initially successful, this attack led to many casualties, as the Crusaders either overstayed their welcome by looting the Muslim camp or were trampled on their way back to the tiny gate. Rather than risking a prolonged siege, where he had to feed 40,000 men, Keboga launched an offensive along the steep slope of the mountain, and his troops poured out of the citadel into Antioch through a single jagged pass. This attack was coordinated with another assault along the south walls, forcing the Crusaders to fight on 2 fronts. For 2 days, the assault raged on from dawn to dusk, and a Crusader who lived through this terror remarked that a man with food had no time to eat, and a man with water no time to drink. Endless waves of attackers were cut down, only for more to appear. The cold winter now seemed like a distant dream, as men collapsed from exhaustion under the summer heat. Many, including well-known knights, began to desert by throwing ropes over the walls. Their number was so great that the rest called them rope dancers. Most of them were rounded up and slain by the Seljuks. In order to prevent the total collapse of the garrison, the leaders swore an oath not to abandon the city and sealed the gates. The unrelenting assault, difficult conditions, and death toll were more severe than anything the Crusaders had to face before. At one point, Beaumont, who was in the thick of the fighting, was surrounded by enemies and was narrowly saved by Robert of Flanders and Robert of Normandy, while elsewhere, an Italian knight, known to us as Mad Hugh, defended a tower single-handedly, breaking 3 spears in the process. 4 days into the endless onslaught, Beaumont ordered several buildings to be burned down after finding out that some men were hiding there. As one might expect, the fire got out of hand and burned a large chunk of the city. On the night of the 13th to 14th of June, at the brink of the Crusader collapse, a comet was seen in the dark sky. There are too many comets in this sci-fi story, which the clergy used to rally the soldiers one last time. This glimpse of hope gave them the strength to last the night. This comet, alongside the fire burning from within the city, demoralized the Seljuks, who pulled back after one of the bloodiest battles in medieval warfare. Keboga suffered terrible losses, but so did the Crusaders, so the Muslim army spread out and completely surrounded the city. Now all they had to do was wait and watch the Latins die from starvation atop the citadel. Desperate and with no way out, Godfrey lost 200 men in an attempt to raid the Muslim camp outside St. Paul's Gate. Meanwhile, Tancred went on a stealth mission with 10 men and returned with 6 Seljuk heads, and Henri of Esch repelled a whole contingent attempting to climb the walls with ladders with just 2 of his relatives, who gave their life in the process. Despite these brave attempts, the situation seemed hopeless as the weeks dragged on. To fight off hunger, the Crusaders boiled the skins of horses, camels, donkeys, and woodland plants as their numbers continued to decline. But then on June 10th, a peasant from Provence named Peter Bartholomew confessed that he had been having visions, telling him that the spear that pierced Jesus during his crucifixion was now buried under the Basilica of St. Peter. Many, including Bishop Adhemar, were skeptical about this tale, since they saw the Holy Lance in the vault of Constantinople during their journey. But others, like Raymond, believed Peter and commissioned 12 men who began the excavation. Despite digging for an entire day, they found nothing until Peter jumped in the hole barefooted and began to pray. Then suddenly a small shard of metal was found, and the entire host rejoiced. It's difficult to imagine or describe the profound effect that this relic had on the army, but even modern scholars agree that this shard had a profound impact on Crusader morale. Later that year, the Latins would write to the Pope, "We were so comforted and strengthened by the lance's discovery, and by so many other divine revelations, that some of us who had been discouraged and fearful beforehand then became courageous and resolute to fight, and encouraged each other."
And so the Latins are able to defend themselves against these Muslims and are able to finally take Antioch. So we're going to skip forward to that. So what happens once Antioch is finally taken?
The road to Jerusalem was open. The triumph at Antioch was nothing short of miraculous. Heat, cold, disease, and desertion failed to disperse the expedition. Yet now the Council of Princes decided to stop and wait out the summer in order to recuperate. The plan was to leave for Jerusalem on November 1st, but in reality, no Crusader would see the walls of the Holy City for over a year. Rather than consolidate, the Crusaders were split into 2 large camps, arguing over the claim over Antioch and the oath to Alexios. On one hand, everyone swore to return every city they took to the Romans, but on another, the princes agreed to cede the city to Bohemond, provided that he took it, which he did. To settle the differences, the Crusaders sent out Hugh of Vermandois as an envoy to the emperor. This brings us to one of the most important and misunderstood moments in this story. Did Alexios abandon the Crusaders? Back in June 1098, Alexios was leading an army in Anatolia and camped at Philomelion, when he met Stephen of Blois and a couple of other deserters from the siege of Antioch. There the Crusader told Alexios that the situation was hopeless and that he should abandon the cause. Latin sources denounce both men as cowards and pick this moment as the reason why their relationship soured, but the reality is, as usual, a lot more nuanced. Alexios did turn back, but he never intended to march as far as Antioch, due to the logistical strain it would entail on a large army, not to mention that he was well aware that his absence could lead to rebellion or even a civil war, both of which he had already had to deal with on multiple occasions. Furthermore, he also received news that the Seljuks were preparing another invasion, a threat he took seriously, since he evacuated the citizens of that region to protect them from the nomads. Indeed, an attack was attempted on Pipert, which ultimately failed due to the military prowess of the semi-autonomous leader of Trebizond, Theodoric Gabrus. So even when Hugh met Alexios in Constantinople some months later, the emperor could offer little more than the continuous naval supply that kept the Latins fed until this point. And yet the report that Bohemond was serious about keeping the city for himself infuriated the Byzantine court, ending their goodwill and starting a new phase in the history of the Crusade. Rather than return to his fellow Crusaders, the Count left for France, only to be chastised by his countrymen, who saw him as a coward and embarrassment. He would later join the Crusade of 1101 and die fighting, but that is another story that we'll tell in the future.
So there you go. There is the full betrayal of Byzantium with the siege of Antioch. And after that, relations between the Byzantines and the Crusaders would never, ever be the same. Now, Bohemond of Taranto is the one who ends up taking control of Antioch. Raymond of Toulouse actually requests that they give it back to Alexios. Again, Raymond being the incredibly wealthy prince of France, even more wealthier than the king of France, who had the largest Crusader army. So that kind of sets the stage for why the betrayal and why Alexios sort of washes his hands of the Crusaders, because from his understanding, he's told Antioch is doomed. He returns back to Constantinople, and yet to the surprise of everyone, even the Crusaders, they're able to hold on to Antioch. So let me catch up on some of the super chats, guys. Let's see, we got 13 out of 30. Now, this is a community-sponsored stream. You guys chose this stream, so if you could, help me out. It took me a lot of preparation and just watching all this stuff so I would know what sections to show you, because I know you guys prefer visual graphics as opposed to me just reading study guides and information to you. So the stream took quite a bit of prep. I hope you are enjoying it. I want to catch up with some of the super chats here. Let's see. Oh, yeah, we read this one. Taint Nuffums throws in 5, says, let's not forget about when the Pope sanctioned crusades against the Rus lands while they were also being invaded by the Mongols. Yes, that's actually one of the later crusades after the sacking of Constantinople. And it's the Mongol horde that basically ends the primacy of Bulgaria. During the Fourth Crusade, even more powerful than the Latin control of Constantinople or the Empire of Nicaea that John Vatatzis was ruling at the time in Anatolia. It was the Bulgarians. It was Tsar Ivan Asen that was really had the strongest force in that region of the world. And it's the Mongols, the Golden Horde that comes, that basically ends the golden era of the Bulgarians. Now, they were already Orthodox at that time, but yeah, that's something that, again, there's so much. How do I break down the Crusades? You wanted me to do an overview of the whole Crusades. Well, technically there's 8, but there's 4 main ones. So I did my best to try to present what I perceive to be as the most important information regarding the Crusades from the Orthodox perspective. Mr. Funzerker throws in 5, says, imagine you lived on one of these islands and you see ships flying the cross. You go out to meet them and they start ransacking your village. Yes, and that actually happened. Scott throws in 5, says, excited for the stream. Here's a little support, brother. Well, thank you very much. Great, Scott. I do appreciate that, my man. Pufferfish, member for 1 month of the Codal Crew, says, why is it always fatzos and pencil necks who think the Crusades were based? I think it's an easy way to sort of flex sort of military power, easy enemy being the Muslims. But I would suspect a lot of the people that push the Crusades are more pushing the meme, the Deus Vult meme. They probably don't know much about the Crusades. At least some of the people I spoke to, when it came to actual details of like what unfolded, they had a very generic Western belief that this was just Catholics going and conquering the Holy Land against Muslims to save Christians, and that the Orthodox should be thankful. It's like, bro, that's not what happened at all. Wayo Clay become a Codal Crew member. God bless you, brother. Thank you. And so did Randall Gregory became a Codal Crew member. God bless you guys. And Great Scott, thank you very much. Throws in 5, says, let's go. That's right, guys. We got a goal today. If you appreciate this type of stream, information, content, please support. If you have any questions or comments, I would greatly appreciate that as well. And Great Scott gifted 5 Codal Crew memberships. Thank you so much, my brother. Texas Nevsky throws in 5, says, I'm lurking while fishing. We'll have to be on a replay, gang, tomorrow. God bless, and Christ is risen. Truly he is risen. Well, thank you, Texas Nevsky, for the support. I hope you enjoy the fishing and hope you catch something big. Henry throws in another 5, says, Christ is risen. Truly he is risen. And Byzantine Soldier throws in 349, says, I enjoyed this stream, but I missed 2 hours. Well, you have to go back. We still have more. We got plenty of more to get into still, so stay tuned. And then over on Dono Chat, nothing on Dono Chat. On Streamlabs, Victor Z throws in a generous $30 and says, excited for this one. Great topic. Well, thank you very much, Victor Z. God bless you. And I don't know whose name this is. It's just a series of numbers and letters. Throws in $10. Oh, it's Robert Haga. Oh, it's a member of the Logos Academy. He said, Christos Anesti, truly he is risen. Robert Haga throws in $10. He's a friend. He's a member of the Logos Academy, former Lutheran, now becoming Orthodox. So shout out to you, Robert. Hope you had a blessed Pascha. I know you did. We talked about it in the men's group. But thank you so much, brother, for the $10 super chat. I really appreciate that. And Brendan throws in 5 on Streamlabs. Says, ironically, the Latin/Catholic conception of just war, with its penitential element, rendered the spirit of the Latins more akin to that of Islamic jihad. Exactly. That is a fantastic point, Brendan. The penitential argument for the Holy War by Urban II literally creates a sentiment towards warfare that is congenial with Islamic jihad. And so he said, it rendered the spirit of Latins more akin to that of Islamic jihad. Taking otherwise legitimate action against Islamic expansionism post-schism proved to be catastrophic. Yes, it did, unfortunately. Unfortunately. So guys, everybody here, support the stream a little bit. Can we at least get up to like 17? Can we at least where's the pay piggies at? I know you guys are appreciated. We still got so much to dive into still. Regarding the stream, where's the pay piggies at? We're it's time to tithe. We need the codal tithe. Let me cover a little bit more on my document here, because now we've kind of hit the main thrust here of the First Crusade. I mean, again, like I said, we're not getting into the siege of Jerusalem, all the conquest and potential victories of the Latins. We're going to be focusing on, again, the Byzantine perspective here. Oh, thank you very much. Nephilim Bone Excavator throws in 5, says, for the goal. Thanks for your hard work, DPH. Well, thank you, Nephilim Bone Excavator. That's a hell of a name. Thank you for your support. I do appreciate it. Toby says, I debate Muslims on X and get many death threats. Yeah. The only person to provide me with a death threat for content I make is also a Muslim. So go figure. And I don't even talk about Islam that much. I did a stream, this was like 2 years ago, talking about Islam. I don't even know what the specific function of the stream was or what the topic was, but I ended up getting an email from a Muslim who somehow found my home address and threatened to kill me. Nothing came of it, but it was surreal. So yes, I'm not surprised, Toby, that potentially happened. And Texas Nevsky throws in another 2, says, Pay Piggy checking in. Well, thank you. Oink, oink. Thank you for that, Texas Nevsky. I really appreciate that. Can we at least get one more, and I'll continue going to the next section here. One more super chat, one more piece of support, and we'll go to the next section. I can't hold you guys. I enjoy doing these streams too much to truly hold you guys in purgatory like Andrew and Jim Bob do, but not move forward with the stream. But I want to present what we have next. One more, guys. It's like the Hunger Games. Usual suspects. Yeah, exactly. Come on, guys. One more, and we'll continue the stream. Who's going to help me out there? There we go. Thank you very much, Mr. Fist. Mr. Fist throws in a generous $10. We got Oink Oink Pay Piggy. Thank you so much, brother. And Henry throws in another $2. Thank you guys so much. All right, with that, now we can get back to the stream here. Okay, so what I want to do, and Octavian. Oh, here we go. Octavian throws in $2, says, Orthodoxy is the one royal and narrow path. Glory to God for that. Amen. Byzantine Soldier throws in 9, New Zealand, and says, Pay Piggy to eat bacon for the goal. Thank you, Byzantine Soldier. And Wyoclay throws $10 in. Thank you so much, Wyoclay. Oh, I know who this is. Darth Grumpy Dad. Also a Logos Academy member, says history nerds cough it up. Thank you very much, brother. Hope you're doing well. We missed you in the last meeting. We have a meeting tomorrow night, so I hope you're able to join us. Texas Nevsky throws in $2, says uno mas. Thank you so much, Texas Nevsky. I really appreciate you. Appreciate all you guys support my work. Seriously, legitimately, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And Great Scott throws in 5, says, got you, brother. Well, thank you so much, man. Thank you so much, guys. That will allow me to get to the next section of the stream here. So I want to show you guys some of the important Orthodox Byzantine players in all of this. So I'll quickly go through the rest of the Crusader. So you have Louis the Seventh of France, devout but ineffectual pilgrim, basically militarily weak, logistically burdensome, failed at Damascus during the Second Crusade, seen as a king whose piety exceeded his competence. Second Crusade's basically a disaster. Nothing's gained from it. Another member of the Second Crusade is King Conrad III of Germany, impulsive commander, as we'll see here, advanced prematurely into Anatolia and suffered devastating defeat. I'm going to show you guys that next. Reckless and undisciplined, confirmed fears about Western military unpredictability. Now, the Third Crusade has some competent warriors, but as I said, at this point, the Byzantines have really pulled back. They're not helping a ton regarding the Crusades. And you have Frederick Barbarossa, probably the most competent crusader ever, who didn't even make it to the Holy Land. He died en route in 1190, but probably was the most respected amongst the Byzantines, not because they admired him personally, but because how of a serious warrior and commander he was. Yet he was still viewed with suspicion and represented a competing claim to Roman imperial identity. True emperor, but not the emperor. So then you had, of course, Richard of England, Richard Lionheart, led successful campaigns, Acre, coastal victories, failed to retake Jerusalem, lost to Saladin, even though he beat Saladin in other periods. Admired tactically, but politically detached from Byzantine concerns, acting within a fully Western framework. Fourth Crusade, you have Enrico Dandolo. He's one of the Venetians that helped steer the Fourth Crusade to the sacking of Constantinople. Our perspective of him, extremely negative. Extremely negative. He was calculating, materially motivated, and instrumental in turning Crusade into an anti-Christian violence, anti-Orthodox violence, essentially. You get Boniface of Montferrat, really not important, but does play a factor in the Latin Empire, the brief Latin Empire. And now it comes to imperial defenders. Who are the Byzantines? Who are the famous Byzantines you need to know in regards to the Crusader history? We've already been introduced to Alexios Komnenos, Alexios I, Emperor of Byzantium, rebuilt Byzantium after Manzikert, initiated an appeal for the First Crusade, managed Crusaders diplomatically, preserver of the empire at its weakest moment, represents prudence, realism, and strategic restraint. His son, John II, is who rules after him. Continued reconquest of Anatolia, strengthened internal stability and administration. Famous for humility, justice, and piety, often seen as embodying Orthodox kingship at its best. That is John II Komnenos. Then you have Manuel I Komnenos, who you're also introduced to in that general overview video that we watched, who was too pro-Western, emptied the coffers of the imperial treasury due to all the expenses he paid for Western and soldiers, doing nightly activities and sports activities he would pay for, stuff like that. He managed the Second Crusade, we kind of talked about, represents the last serious attempt to politically unify Christendom, remembered for overreach toward the West and depleted imperial treasury. Then you have Alexios Doukas in 1204. He's the last defender of Constantinople. He led resistance against the Fourth Crusade, attempted to defend Constantinople in its finest moments. It's a symbol of honor and defeat and represents the last stand before catastrophe. The restores after catastrophe. So who are the main people that we should focus on as Orthodox after the sacking of Constantinople? You have Theodore Lascaris, Theodore the First, founder in exile, established the Byzantine successor state after 1204, preserved imperial legitimacy, and ensured the continuity of Orthodox Roman identity. Then you have our favorite, St. John III, Ducas Vatatzes, from 1222 to 1254, the just king and provider. One of the few out of these people that are actually saints, by the way. He strengthened the economy, army, and society, expanded the Nicaean power. Now remember, he never ruled inside Constantinople. Known for charity, justice, and care for the poor, venerated as a saint in Orthodoxy, one of the most beloved Byzantine rulers of all time. And then you have Michael Palaiologos, who is the restorer of Constantinople, but it's a little bit complicated, as we'll see. If you guys want, we'll play that video. Michael the Eighth, Palaiologos, what does he do? Well, after John Vatatzes he reposes, his son becomes the leader of the Nicaean Empire. After him, his son is going to become the Nicaean emperor, but he's very, very small. Michael Palaiologos takes this as an opportunity to actually attack the Nicaeans during the funeral of St. John Vatatzes' son. During that funeral, his grandson then has to hide under an altar from Michael Palaiologos, Michael Palaiologos then blinds his grandson at the age of 15. That's how Michael Palaiologos becomes the emperor of the Byzantine Empire when he then takes back Constantinople. So yes, he does recapture Constantinople in 1261, but he did so by also betraying the heritage of John Vatatzes, who then, after he becomes emperor, marries off the whole lineage of John Vatatzes to lower nobles so that his lineage will never be around the imperial throne again. And it's the Palaiologos dynasty that lasts until the end of Constantinople in 1253. So he recaptures it, yes. He is a political hero, but controversial due to attempts to union with Rome. He's a crucial figure, but again, mixed reactions. He wasn't exactly a nice guy. And in fact, because of what he does to the heritage and the lineage of St. John Vatatzes, he's actually condemned by the Orthodox Church. They said that is way too far to basically forcibly marry off his entire lineage so that they'll never be a competitor to the throne. And then who are the witnesses and the interpreters? Well, you heard Anna Komnene. That is the daughter of Alexios. She wrote the Alexiad. You probably heard that multiple times in these videos. They refer back to what the Alexiad said. This is her historical description of the First Crusade. She is the daughter of the emperor. Provides the Byzantine lens on Crusaders. Describes them as brave, but often arrogant and unpredictable. And then you have Nikitas, witness of 1204. So he is the Byzantine chronicler of the sacking of Constantinople. He chronicled the Fourth Crusade and sack of Constantinople. His writings form the emotional and moral memory of 1204 for Orthodox people and expresses outrage at the Latin actions. So that is an introduction to all the people that will now be mentioned, the significant people for our discussion moving forward, okay? Orthonaut throws in 5, says, wife, I wonder what he's thinking about. Me, pondering Byzantium and the Latin betrayal. Yeah. Actually, that is like an actual conversation between my wife and I. Edward throws in 5, says, thanks for the great content. I'm an Anglican in country Victoria, Australia, and I'm very disappointed in the new Archbishop of Canterbury is a woman. Yeah, so you don't have an archbishop, essentially. But thank you for the support. Byzantine Soldier throws in 349, says, I've got a St. John Vatatzes jumper at home. Very nice. And Nathaniel throws in 5, says, isn't Nicaea pronounced with a soft C, or are you using the Greek pronunciation? I'm using the pronunciation that refers to that particular empire. It's referred to as Nicaea instead of Nicaea. Yes, I'm aware of the Council of Nicaea. I'm referred to of that pronunciation, but it's always referred to, at least from all the documentaries and stuff that I looked up to, they always refer to it as Nicaea. So I'm just using that pronunciation just to be consistent with the resources that I used for today's stream. So just want to also remind everyone, if you enjoy content like this and you enjoy deep dives into theology, philosophy, history, geopolitics, we meet every Tuesday night at 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time over in the Logos Academy. It's a men's-only community. And tomorrow night, we're going to be diving into the geopolitics because we're waiting right now for Trump. He's given another ultimatum on this ceasefire, which we're going to find out tomorrow night whether we go back into full-blown war. The U.S. just bombed a cargo ship, an Iranian cargo ship, yesterday or this morning. I don't know the exact time. Hit the engine room. This is reported by CENTCOM. And so it looks like the war is back on, although it's not officially back on. Of course, there's a peace negotiation or ceasefire with Lebanon and Israel. So we're going to be diving into all that stuff in the private meeting. If you guys want to get access, join us. Of course, there's tons of exclusive content. Also, if you guys want to sponsor a stream, now today's stream is sponsored by you guys. The community sponsored today's stream, of which we'll do more fundraising for sponsored streams. But you guys sponsored today's stream. Major thank you to you. And if you would like to sponsor a stream yourself, you can do so with that link right there. I'd love to see what topic you want to dive into. And also, if you would be interested in my book, The Ultimate Christian Critique of Transhumanism, Return to Babylon from Adam to Antichrist, you can get signed versions right there. If you're interested in peptides, go to leveluphealth.com, get the highest quality peptides using promo code COTEL, COTEL, and you use that same promo code to get a discount over at orthodoxdepot.com. Orthodoxdepot.com, they got prayer ropes, incense, study Bibles, whatever it may be. Use those promo codes. You guys will get a discount on any of that stuff. All right, so let's get back. We've already kind of covered the First Crusade, right? I don't know how much more. Again, if you're interested in all this stuff, there's still like 2.5 hours left in this documentary if you guys want to watch all of that. We're going to move forward, but there's a little bit more here, and then we're going to move into Crusade number 2, skip number 3, and then we're going to get into the sacking of Constantinople because that's really all that's left. So this is what happens after the Latins take Antioch. They tell Alexios, Emperor of Byzantium, they are not giving it back, and this is what they end up doing in return.
Back in Antioch, the lines were drawn, and most of the princes aligned themselves with Bohemond, secretly ceding their portions of the walls to him. Raymond of Toulouse positioned himself as his arch-nemesis and occupied the bridge gate, the lifeline to the coast, as well as the governor's palace. He even attempted to take the citadel for himself, but its commander, Ahmad ibn Marwan, proclaimed that he would only surrender to Bohemond. Despite being the most stubborn of the princes, when it came to swearing his oath to Alexios, Raymond insisted that the words he uttered while holding the sacred relics shouldn't be discarded, and he was willing to sabotage the entire crusade just so Bohemond wouldn't get what he wanted. In the meantime, Bohemond was busy. He restored the Cathedral of St. Peter, allowed the Greek Patriarch John IV to return to his duties, and signed a deal with Genoa on July 14, 1098. This surviving document tells us so much about the political situation at the time. Genoa received 30 houses near the church and the right to run a market on the square. Bohemond was not mentioned as the owner of the city, but Raymond was singled out from the rest of the Crusaders, and the empire was not even mentioned. The Latins were at an impasse, and both parties were doing everything in their power to prevent the other from winning, while the lesser knights and peasants starved to death. Antioch was now friendly territory, and Byzantine shipments dried up, leaving the less fortunate stuck, only a 3-week march away from their goal. The leaders made an extraordinary announcement, declaring that all participants could freely change their liege lord. This was a game changer, and it's important to take a moment to explain, because we often forget that the medieval world was one bound by religion and vassalage, not culture and nationalities. There was a strict social structure and hierarchy, which was maintained throughout the long expedition. with liege lords big and small on the top, and knights who swore fealty to them below. Additionally, there was a substantial number of commoners hired by the same lords. What we've seen so far was half a dozen branches from different parts of Europe, but in reality, there were hundreds of them to begin with. There was a complicated system of oaths of fealty holding it all together, which was not always based on dynastic ties. For example, Bohemond's nephew, Tancred, was a leader in his own right, with a retinue of his own. So why did the Crusade leaders decide to unravel this structure? On one hand, some were wealthier than others, either due to the funds they had raised at the start of this journey, or because they were more efficient in looting. But more importantly, the mounting death toll as a result of battles, weather, famine, and disease had killed an enormous number of the Latins, both high and low-born. There were many followers who lost their liege lord and were now free of their oaths, so all traditional ties were now broken, and many flocked to the rich entourage of Raymond, but even more decided to join the firmly established county of Edessa as mercenaries. Its ruler Baldwin used this manpower to capture local towns and forts, such as Tel Bashir. What the Crusaders didn't anticipate, however, was for several lesser lords to use this opportunity to carve out domains of their own, such as Raymond Pelé, who gathered a small force and attacked the fertile Jebel as-Samak plateau. He briefly besieged a castle called Tel Manes before its occupants, Syrian Christians, welcomed him inside and accepted his lordship. A week later, he attacked an unnamed castle and reenacted the terrifying chapters of the People's Crusade by slaughtering thousands of Muslims who refused his forced conversion. From there, he left overconfident and low on supplies to take the large city of Marat an-Numan. As the garrison saw his contingent, they sallied out and killed nearly every single member of the expedition.
And so we're going to stop there in the First Crusade, and that's really then the story as the rest is the expansion, attempts to take larger cities in the area, resistance against the Muslims, success ultimately in 1099 regarding the siege, and then the conquest of Jerusalem, with eventually Baldwin, the brother of Godfrey, being elevated as the first king, Baldwin the First, king of Jerusalem. Now we're going to end there. We're going to move over to the Second Crusade. And we're going to just do a quick little section here on Conrad III. This is a German king coming to the Second Crusade. Okay, this is the Second Crusade. This is Manuel the First. Remember, we talked about Comnenos, who was he overextended himself, depleted the imperial treasury by his appeal to the Latin West, was obsessed with Western European culture. Was very sympathetic to the papacy. All this stuff was going on, right? Well, this is his attempt to bring Conrad III into Constantinople and then ferry him across the Bosphorus so that they can begin their journey through Anatolia. And the whole point, and that's why when we went through the people of the list, the Latins and the Byzantines, when we were on the Latins, I talked about Conrad III and that he essentially refused to listen to Manuel talking about passage through Anatolia and which route he should take, and ends up taking the quicker route, and they get decimated by the Muslims. And that's why, again, partly the Second Crusade is a total failure.
And murdered one of the German knights. In response, a group of Swabian knights, led by Frederick, burned down a nearby monastery. Upon hearing of this, the Byzantine army readied for battle, only to be talked down by their commander, Prusch, at the last possible moment. In the end, it was not the Byzantines who punished the Germans, but the local weather. While the German army encamped on the Cherebachi plain, intense rains caused the Melis River to flood most of Conrad's encampment. Believing this to be a punishment from God, the Crusaders then marched all the way to Constantinople without any trouble. The Crusaders received their quarters near Philippatium Palace before the city walls. While this was happening, Emperor Manuel invited King Conrad to his palace and began talks with the German king. Although the Crusaders' actions had been troubling for both rulers, they both managed to maintain amicable relations due to their mutual hatred towards Roger II of Sicily, who was not only an enemy of the German king, but just so happened to have declared war on Byzantium too. The German and Byzantine rulers also had family ties, as Manuel's wife, Bertha von Sulzbach, was Conrad's sister-in-law. The Empress herself played a key role in peaceful talks between both rulers, as new reports began to mount over Crusaders pillaging in the countryside near the city. Though the Roman Emperor managed to strengthen relations with Conrad, he didn't intend for both crusading armies to meet. So Komnenos politely insisted that the German king cross his army to Anatolia as soon as possible. By throwing lavish gifts at the Crusaders and promising to help the Germans whenever they needed, Conrad agreed to Manuel's proposal, thus altering the Crusades' initial plans. Rather than wait for the arrival of the French, the Germans would now march into the Holy Land on their own. As promised, the Byzantine navy helped the German Crusaders sail through the Bosphorus to Chalcedon. In the midst of preparations, part of a French vanguard, made up of French-speaking Lorrainers, reached Constantinople and found the German departure shocking, as it jeopardized the initial plan of a joint Crusader army. The French Lorrainers also counted on German Crusaders to share their rations with them. Whether due to language differences or pure greed, the Germans not only refused, but also abandoned the French Lorrainers as soon as they landed in Asia Minor, much to the horror and protest of the German Lorrainers. Left on their own by the Germans in Constantinople, the Lorraine group would later antagonize the French Crusaders against Conrad's men. As soon as the German host landed in Chalcedon, King Conrad moved to Nicaea, where he had to decide between two potential routes through Anatolia. The first coastal route was longer and prone to raids from Rum Seljuks, but it also had more Byzantine strongpoints, whose garrisons could support the Crusaders. The second mainland route ran through hostile Seljuk territory, but it was much shorter than the previous one. Emperor Manuel tried to help Conrad by sending him a Varangian guide named Stephan, who advised Conrad to move along the Aegean coastline. At first, Conrad followed Stephan's advice, but just a day later he changed his mind and decided to move inland. Still trying to remain cautious, Conrad divided his force in two, leaving one Otto von Freising to march along the coast to Italia through Laodikia with a few men-at-arms and pilgrims, while the main part of the army would march inland through hostile territory. Conrad's motivations behind this decision are hotly debated, but the German king likely intended to quickly capture the Sultanate of Rum's capital at Iconium, where he could resupply his army. Conrad's march through Anatolia went smoothly for as long as the Crusaders marched through Byzantine territory, but the situation quickly changed when the Germans entered Seljuk territory. The Sultan of Rum, Mesut I, did not intend to just let the Crusaders pass freely. Another enemy to the Crusaders was the climate, as most of the German knights and footmen were not used to Anatolian heat. The starved and thirsty Crusaders began to split from the main army near the town of Dorylaeum in order to find provisions. That was exactly what Sultan Mesut was waiting for. From the 25th of October 1147, the divided Crusader contingents began to encounter Turkish horsemen raining down arrows on the unprepared Germans. King Conrad initially intended to repel small Muslim attacks, but as these detachments began to encounter heavier and heavier resistance, he realized his force had just entered into a trap. Soon shouts were heard from all sides as Mesut gathered his troops and charged into the German main force. At first, the German nobles intended to fight, but seeing his men exhausted and dehydrated, Conrad decided to call for an orderly retreat. Not every contingent followed the order and had to withstand Seljuk hit-and-run tactics on their own. During the withdrawal, the Seljuk cavalry constantly harassed the Germans with an unending mix of arrow barrages and melee charges, all the way until the Bosphorus coastline, inflicting heavy losses on the Germans, with reportedly only 1/10 of the army managing to escape from the battlefield. Even Conrad himself was wounded in the neck during the retreat. Beaten down and humiliated, Conrad retreated to Nicaea to resupply and wait for King Louis's French Crusader contingent to arrive. As the German Crusaders suffered a humiliating defeat in the east, another Crusader army had been sailing.
And that's really, we're not going to get into all the details of the Second Crusade, but that's King Conrad III of Germany reluctantly goes along for one day with what Manuel says is take the coastal route. And we have Byzantine cities. You may be harassed a little bit, but you can restock all your goods in the Byzantine cities. Instead, he decides to go through Seljuk Turk territory, which ends disastrous for him. Let me catch up. Again, we're going to now hit into the Fourth Crusade. We're going to skip the Third Crusade, guys. We're not even going to get into the Third Crusade because from the Orthodox perspective, it's just not as important. Nume throws in thoughts on Charlemagne and Charles Martel. Not a fan of Charlemagne. Not a fan of Charlemagne. I mean, you can respect the conquest of the Franks and how successful he was in consolidating power in Western Europe. But Charlemagne was incredibly hostile to the Byzantines because he wanted to be viewed as the Roman emperor, a la his pact with the Pope in the year 800 on Christmas Day to become the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which isn't holy, isn't Roman, and it's not an empire. Because if you know anything about German history, it is entirely fragmented. And France, yes, France had an actual consolidated, centralized power structure. In Germany, German history is characterized by the fracturing of all these different principalities and states. So not a fan of Charlemagne. Byzantine Soldier, 430 gold. Thank you guys so much. And we reached the goal with Kristen Super Chat. Kristen throws in $2. God bless you, sister. Thank you, Byzantine Soldier. And thank you, Kristen, for reaching the goal. God bless you guys. Kristen, I hope you and the family are doing well, by the way, fellow Hoosier. So we always got to stay close. KLW throws in 20, says, in late, but making sure you reach the goal. Thank you very much, KLW. And Octavian throws in 10, says, St. Michael the Brave, St. Vlad the Impaler could have taken Constantinople. All they needed was the Cathes backing for a siege. The Cathes declined like any Antichrist would. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and Rachel, shout out to Rachel Wilson. Oh, our sister Rachel's in the chat. She just gifted 10 Codal Crew memberships. Thank you so much, Rachel. God bless you, sister. Hope you and Andrew and the girls are doing good. God bless you. Thank you so much for that. And she says, hope you and Jenny are doing well. Miss you guys. Well, we miss you. We miss you and Andrew. We'd love to hang out. Thank you so much for that. Been a Codal Crew member for 36 months. 36 months. Thank you so much, Rachel, for your support. God bless you, sister. That's fantastic. All right. Thank you for that. Thank you, everybody, for helping me reach my goal today. Very, very appreciative. Now, we're going to get into the Fourth Crusade. So we jump over here to the Fourth Crusade. I don't know if we want to watch the reconquering of John Vatatzes. I think it's going to take us too much time. We've already, we're close to 3 hours? Yeah, we're almost 3 hours in here. So we're just going to watch the last one. But I highly recommend, if you're interested, the whole, from like right here forward on the Fourth Crusade on Kings and Generals, if you want to watch St. John Vatatzes, Ducas Vatatzes, and how the Empire of Nicaea was able to reconquer Constantinople, I highly recommend it. But it's about 30 minutes long, so we're going to skip it. What we're going to watch instead is what was lost during the sack of Constantinople. So, as you guys know, we've already talked about Fourth Crusade, 1204. The Venetians convinced the Crusader armies to divert from the Holy Land and go straight towards Constantinople, a Constantinople which was not ready for conflict or to be besieged. So their imperial forces are already diminished. They don't have the full force of their military. And you can watch, again, how the Catholics were able to take Constantinople. Essentially, the Theodosian walls were considered totally impregnable at the time, but they enter Constantinople through a different route. Again, you can watch that. They do it through the Golden Horn side where the bay is. Anyways, now, after they enter Constantinople, this is what occurs. This is the tragedy that occurs during the Fourth Crusade.
As depicted in our previous episode, the Crusaders quartered in 3 different parts of the city, which had by this point sustained heavy damage from 3 separate fires. One of the leaders of the Crusade, the Marquis of Montferrat, Boniface, took the palace of Bucolion, where he found all the prominent ladies of the court. Count Baldwin of Flanders took quarters in the palace of Blakeney, while the Doge Enrico Dandolo occupied the Hagia Sophia. Alexios III had left with the entire treasury, and the Crusaders were determined to receive what they were promised by Alexios IV. But having learned their lesson from the infighting that occurred over spoils in Zara, they laid out a plan on how to sack the city. The citizens were not to be harmed, especially if they were Latins, and all the gathered spoils would be collected in designated piles within several churches, and then divided equally, half going to the Venetians and the second half to the Crusaders. Every major leader condemned acts of violence and selfishness under the threat of excommunication. Despite these clear instructions, many men turned to savages as they took spoils for themselves, while raping and killing innocent citizens. One particular episode describes a knight carrying loot on his shield stacked up to his chin. That knight and many others were hanged immediately. One of the primary contemporary chroniclers, Nikitas Konietis, describes an event from which we can draw several conclusions. As he and his wife were attempting to leave the city 5 days after it fell, they saw a young girl who was grabbed by a knight and dragged through the streets until he barred the door of his newfound home with her inside. The act was reported to other knights nearby, who immediately threatened him with death if he did not release the girl, at which point he obeyed. Yet again we see the division in the Crusader camp, with some choosing to disobey direct orders, but most following them out of discipline, oaths, or fear. But while they did their best to limit violence, their greed rolled over the city, destroying artifacts, monuments, and works of art. The imperial treasury was empty, so the Crusaders began stripping metal ornaments, ivory containers, pearls, and precious stones, melted down chalices and relics, plundered churches, and the stone homes of the rich, which were left exposed by the fire after it devoured the timber houses of the commoners. Around half of the population of the city was left homeless and became refugees, making their way to Bulgaria and the new successor states. The Church of the Holy Apostles, also known as the Imperial Cemetery, which for more than 700 years was the second most important church in the city, was already ransacked by Alexios III when he was gathering a tribute that was demanded of him from the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. But that did not stop the Crusaders from breaking into the sarcophagi of the buried emperors, including Constantine, Justinian and Theodora, Heraclius, and many others. The invaders were surprised to find Justinian's body still intact, with no signs of rot.
They were surprised to find Saint Justinian's body, his reposed body, not decomposing? I mean, are you hearing what's going on here? Is the Latins, because the retreating emperor, the Byzantine emperor, took the treasury with him, they then begin destroying all of the Orthodox churches. Anything that has gold, anything that has value, they smelt down so that they can be brought back to Western Europe. And we're going to see all of the important things that were taken. I mean, these are like ancient wonders of the world. You have to imagine Constantinople, by all parties, was considered the most beautiful city in the world. It was the seat of civilization. And you have Latins going down here trying to loot the tombs of Byzantine emperors, and then surprised to find that some of the saints, their bodies aren't actually decomposed.
The bodies themselves were untouched, but the precious objects Alexius III didn't dare to touch were taken to the pile of spoils. Every church was ransacked, including the great Hagia Sophia, with its great golden altar, engraved with the colors of 72 pearls, cut into pieces and carted off on mules. The heavy load and slippery marble floor caused some of the animals to slip and fall, and before long, the floor of the temple was covered in blood and excrements. The empire was dead.
You hear that? The most beautiful Christian church in the entire world, Hagia Sophia, was left with fecal matter and blood all across the floor as the Latins stole everything that was inside of it.
And now the vultures were dismembering its corpse. Countless marble statues and columns were shipped off and sold. The harbor chain that protected the Golden Horn was separated into pieces and delivered to Acre alongside the very gates of the city. Doors, furniture, silk, and other valuables were also sold or sent back to the west. The Catholics found no interest in icons, which were not nearly as popular in the Catholic world, so they destroyed or desecrated a vast quantity of them to the dismay of the local populace. And yet, the biggest tragedy was what they did to the numerous bronze works of art throughout the city. Giant statues, symbolizing authority, beauty, strength, and wisdom, were thrown into the smelters and melted down to be turned into cheap copper coins. Among them were a statue of Hera, charioteers, a man wrestling with a lion, a monument celebrating Actium, a statue of Aphrodite being handed the golden apple of discord by Paris of Troy, a bronze statue of the she-wolf suckling the founders of Rome, a tetrapylon built by Theodosius with a beautiful facade that depicted birds, sheep, lamb, fish, as well as mythological creatures and figures, with a large bronze pyramid and a female figure that acted as a weather vane showing the direction of the wind. This is just the beginning of the list. Among the lost cultural items was a crocodile with prickly bronze scales clutching a struggling African buffalo in its jaws. The Nile bull, as the locals called it, attempted to break free by biting the crocodile, both killing each other in the process, neither achieving its goal. Another smelted art piece was a large statue that stood at the base of the Forum of Theodosius, depicting the hero of the ancient Greek myth Bellerophon as he gazed towards the sun, riding the winged Pegasus, alongside a large bronze eagle with extended wings and a coiled snake in its claws. The latter also served as a sundial, with its wings split into 12 sections, from which the observer could determine the hour of the day. Also lost was a massive bronze sculpture made by the legendary Lysippos, the personal sculptor of Alexander the Great, whose pupil constructed the Colossus of Rhodes. Lysippos created a giant Heracles with a lion skin over him and a club in his hands. His shin was as tall as a man, and a man's belt could go around his thumb. The masterpiece was cut piece by piece and thrown into the fire like all the rest. Sphinxes, sea monsters, and other mythological creatures were also destroyed. For the description of the last notable statue, we turn to the contemporary chronicler. What of the white-armed, beautiful-ankled, and long-necked Helen, who mustered the entire host of the Hellenes and overthrew Troy, whence she sailed to the Nile and after a long absence returned to the abodes of the Laconians? Was she able to placate the implacable? Was she able to soften those men whose hearts were made of iron? On the contrary, she who had enslaved every onlooker with her beauty was wholly unable to achieve this, even though she was apparelled ornately. Though fashioned of bronze, she appeared as fresh as the morning dew, anointed with the moistness of erotic love on her garment, veil, diadem, and braid of hair. Her vesture was finer than spider webs, and the veil was cunningly wrought in its place. The diadem of gold and precious stones which bound the forehead was radiant, and the braid of hair that extended down to her knees, flowing down and blowing in the breeze, was bound tightly in the back with a hairband. The lips were like flower cups, slightly parted as though she were about to speak. The graceful smile, at once greeting the spectator, filled him with delight. Her flashing eyes, her arched eyebrows, and the shapeliness of the rest of her body were such that they cannot be described in words and depicted for future generations. O Helen, Tyndareus' daughter, the very essence of loveliness, offshoot of Eretes, ward of Aphrodite, nature's most perfect gift, the contested prize of Trojans and Hellenes, where is your drug granted you by Thon's wife, which banishes pain and sorrow, and brings forgetfulness of every ill? Where are your irresistible love charms? Why did you not make use of these now as you did long ago? But I suspect that the fates had foredordained that you should succumb to the flame's fervor, so that your image should no longer arouse spectators' sexual passions. It is said that these Anidae condemned you to the flames as retribution for Troy's having been laid waste by the firebrand because of your scandalous amours. But the gold madness of these men does not allow me to conceive and utter such a thing, for that madness was the reason why rare and excellent works of art everywhere were given over to total destruction. Considering the extensive list of art that was present all over the city, in the Forum, Hippodrome, overlooking the streets and churches, it's easy to see why the citizens of the empire considered themselves Roman. The Fourth Crusade didn't just demolish monuments, it struck a blow against their identity, severing their ties with antiquity. One of the few bronze works of art that were not thrown into the smelters was the quadriga. These were 4 life-sized bronze-gilded horses, originally sat on the top of Hadrian's mausoleum before they were moved to the hippodrome. The Venetians took these horses, cut off their heads and transported them to Venice, where they were reassembled and put on top of the St. Mark Church, with collars on their neck to hide the cut. The brilliant works of art overlooked the city until history once again repeated itself. Napoleon took control of Venice in 1797 and forcibly removed the statues, along with an immense quantity of art from all over Italy. Yet again, gold and silver objects were melted down to pay salaries, but the Chariot of the Gods was placed on top of the newly commissioned Arc de Triomphe before it was returned to Venice following the Congress of Vienna. Along with the horses, St. Mark's Basilica was decorated with the Carmignola, 4 life-size sculptures of the Tetrarchs, and marvelous pillars of Acca. Additionally, Venice also sees the Colossus of Barletta, a massive bronze statue of either Marcian or Leo I, which washed up on the beach of Barletta after the ship that carried it sank. This clearly shows that, unlike the rest of the Crusaders, the Venetians preferred to preserve the bronze statues rather than smelt them and turn them into coins. One theory suggests that the reason behind this was that the Franks considered the great bronze statues to glorify polytheism, making them go out of their way to destroy them for very little monetary gain. But Venice was not the only one that got to bring trophies home. Over the next few decades, many artifacts were shipped off to the West. The head relics and bones of multiple patriarchs and saints, including Andrew, the patron saint of Constantinople, were taken by various cardinals and clergymen. Conrad of Krosigk, Bishop of Halberstadt, was one of the Crusaders who sacked the city, and a year later he returned home, enriching his cathedral with several precious artifacts. The blood of Christ, a strand of the Virgin Mary's hair, pieces of the true cross, the crown of thorns, his purple robe, and his sandals, along with other objects attributed to various apostles and saints, several gold discs, and 2 ivory panels. Traditionally, splinters of the true cross were stored in special precious containers, which the Crusaders scattered to Limburg, Trier, Koblenz, Amiens, and Rome, with the largest of them going to Paris. The French city also obtained the mysterious Shroud of Turin, bearing the negative image of a man, leading many to believe that this was the burial shroud that Jesus was wrapped in. Paris received many other great artifacts, a majority of which were destroyed during the French Revolution centuries later. Robert of Clary was a low-born French knight who provided us with a glimpse of the treasures that were lost to us. Not even one person above earth, as much as he had lived in this city, would be able to count and tell the riches, because whoever narrated even the slightest about this wealth, about the beauty and precious things that were found in the monasteries, churches, and palaces, and in the city, would appear a liar, and not one would believe him. Another account of one of the leaders of the Crusade tells us how the great heaps of spoils were split in half, with the Crusaders receiving 150,000, of which 50,000 went to Venice, alongside their own share of 150,000 marks. But this figure does not account for all the precious treasures that were destroyed, melted, sold, or shipped off. In reality, this was arguably the greatest loss of art in human history. When the Western Roman Empire fell, Constantinople became a bastion of knowledge and art, keeping the secrets of both behind its tall walls. The Fourth Crusade opened those walls and spread the spoils all over Western Europe, arguably setting the foundation of the Renaissance. The stone and marble statues were cut, the bronze marvels smelted, the churches and palaces were plundered, and now the Crusaders were preparing to divide the land and elect the first emperor of this new Latin Empire to spread their reign over the remnants of the shattered Roman one. In our next video, we will talk about this partition and the reaction of the local polities.
So that does it. It's kind of hard to watch. I mean, as I saw one scholar compare it, is that whatever wisdom or knowledge was lost in the burning of the Library of Alexandria, you could multiply the value with the sacking of Constantinople due to all the opulent wealth. If you're Christian, the immense relics. We're talking about a large portion of the true cross, of which the Latins then cut up into pieces. That's why whenever you see a piece of the true cross now, it's like a little bit of a splinter of it. Well, who did all that? All the bronze statues, and they said the Catholics did it out of fear of polytheism. For the Byzantines, this is the history of the Greek people. This is the history of the Roman people. That's why they had the she-wolf with the two founders of Rome suckling underneath it. It's because this was the seat of civilization. This was the highest expression of human culture on the planet at the time. As we said, the aristocratic elite, the average people that lived in Constantinople were reading the Iliad, Aristotle, Plato. They were familiar with all the ancient myths and legends. And that's why they viewed the rest of Western Europe as barbarous. When they came, they were lacked sophistication compared to the Byzantines. And yes, that led to a level of arrogance by the Orthodox and the Byzantines, but to some degree it was true too, as we've highlighted, the ways in which their diplomacy worked, that after being given money and weaponry and food, they would still ransack Orthodox cities just out of pure opportunity. And that's why they acquired the reputation of being greedy. Westerners were considered greedy, opportunistic, and rude. And as we look through the history of the Crusades from an Orthodox perspective, you can see how the narrative is very different. The narrative that we constructed here for the last 3 hours is one of an immense rivalry. In fact, a jealousy of the West, of what the East had. And we see a new theology emerge in the West, where now, penitence can be acquired through crusades, through killing, through warfare. Warfare becomes sacramental as long as it expands papal supremacy. This is unheard of in the East. And it's the East, it's the Orthodox that are constantly dealing with Muslim invasions, incursions, the success of the Seljuk Turks after Manzikert. They're dealing with the reality. The Catholics just show up with the ideal of establishing and reconquering Jerusalem, which they do in 1099. But of course, they lose that to Saladin very soon after. What they had it for about 100 years, and in the whole crusade. I mean, they lose all their territory by the end of the 13th century. So basically, it's not even 100 years. They had Jerusalem. It's shorter than that. I'd have to see when Saladin takes it back over. I'm blanking. I know 1099 is the year they get it, but it's just. Once you are Orthodox and then you learn about the Fourth Crusade, you learn about how the people were treated, how women were raped, and then what they did to our churches, what they did to our relics. They would break relics just to distribute them to more places, not just the true cross. We're talking about bones of saints. They would break bones so that they could be distributed to multiple places. The Shroud of Turin. Well, why is it called the Shroud of Turin? It was in Constantinople. Why don't we call it the Shroud of Constantinople? You can see then the Crusade, from the Crusades forward, and most people don't even know about the Byzantine Empire. It's a forgotten point in history itself. That's why it's important to get outside these Western narratives of history and see the nuance, see what's really going on. The Crusade is ultimately a story of rivalry between East and West. It's an attempt by Alexios I Komnenos to reach out and offer a point in which Catholics of the West, Orthodox of the East, could come into unity as brothers, even though 1054 is the Great Schism. 1096 is the First Crusade. We're talking 40-some years later. A lot of animosity has already occurred between the two parties. But it's Alexios that calls on Pope Urban II and says, why don't you send us mercenaries? Why don't we come together and fight the Muslims and reconquer Roman land together? And that turns into a holy crusade for the expansion of papal supremacy and power. And ultimately, it ends in devastation for the Catholics. Ultimately, everything that they try to gain, all the money, all the human capital, all the effort, it's for nothing. And all they did in that opportunity by betraying Byzantium, first with the siege of Antioch, after making oaths to Alexios I that whatever territory they conquer would be given back to the Roman emperor. And in fact, the Roman emperor said, you can even have your own territory. Out of these cities that are specific to us and our Christian heritage that we have historically controlled, we want those back. But if you want to take cities towards Edessa, Damascus, all that, feel free. You guys can have that. We will support your sovereignty over those territories. But instead, they betray the emperor and they begin taking Antioch after the siege. And they take all the coastal cities, Tyre, Acre, and of course Jerusalem in 1099. And that cemented the final division between East and West. It's not just the Great Schism in 1054. That is one. But after the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when the Catholics unexpectedly sack Constantinople and then destroy the entire heritage of Orthodoxy and loot all of the wealth of the most important city in the world, nothing can describe the historical loss that occurred there. It's way more. People lament about the Library of Alexandria. The sack of Constantinople is so much worse. So that's going to do it for our stream today. I hope that was useful for you guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope there was a lot of new insight and things to glean, because what I presented today in 3 hours and 12 minutes is a narrative that most people have never heard about the Crusades. They just LARP, Deus Vult, the Catholics are going to protect the Christians. That's not what happened at all. It turned into a rivalry between Christian groups, and the Catholics set the stage for the continual diminishment and the waning of the Byzantine Empire until they're totally surrounded by the Ottomans in the 15th century. And then it's the end. And that is why, as I said, when the bishops came back from the Council of Florence, the last attempt, the Paleologos dynasty reaching out to the West saying, look, we will unify under the papacy if you come help defend us against the Ottomans. When they came back to their territories, outside of St. Mark of Ephesus, who disagreed with the Council of Florence, outside of him, they all agreed. They said, yeah, we'll adopt papal supremacy. Just send us soldiers. We got to fight the Ottomans. When they came back to their Orthodox lands, the people said, hell no. We would rather suffer under the Ottomans than live under the supremacy of the papacy. And it has to do with this history right here that we just laid out tonight. All right. Nathaniel throws in 10, says, my personal theory is that most of the relics stolen by the Crusaders are hidden in the Vatican archives. They won't admit to it due to the diplomatic nightmare that would cause with the East. I wouldn't be surprised. And think about how many were lost to history. Think of how many things were lost to history due to the chaos of Western Europe we're talking the 13th century. From the 13th century forward, how many things have been lost that we don't even know where they're at anymore? Like the purple robe that Christ wore leading up to the crucifixion, Constantinople had that. I don't know where that exists or if we still have it now, but it's unimaginable. KLW throws in 5, says, consistent on the march towards Antichrist, destruction of identity. Absolutely, and that's what they did. Seth Marshall became a Kotal Crew member. Thank you so much, Seth. Welcome, brother. Appreciate the support. And let me just double check on the Dono chat and see, what did you guys think of tonight's stream? Yeah, Bloomer Slayer says, that boggles the mind. Yeah. The Northern Frenchmen, the Normans. Sadly, that's where I think my dad has Norman ancestry. I think I might be genetically tied with those people, but it was the Normans that Alexios said you can't trust. You can't trust the Normans. And, of course, as the first crusade unfolded, that was exactly the case. Wild Clay said, W stream, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on us. True. Amen to that. I don't know about the Testicular says, none of the evils in the world would be possible without Roman Catholics. They certainly contributed to quite a few. I don't know if that's totally the case. There's evils before the Catholic Church. Jacob says, great stream, particularly that final summary, has me thinking about several long-lasting traits of the West. Yeah. Jason says, plus the papacy was racist against the Romans. Yes, and called them heretical Greeks, denying them their Romanness. The Ottomans, on the other hand, didn't. Yes, that's a great point, Jason. And that's why, again, what I say about the Holy Roman Empire, it wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't an empire. And that is part of this jealousy. You almost, once you see the Crusades from the Orthodox perspective, you cannot not see a sort of Cain and Abel. You see a jealousy, a Western jealousy when they come to... Remember Stephen... what was it, a Stephen of Burgundy, and his wife, who basically told him, you're going to the crusade. And then he arrives at the court hosted by Alexios, and he writes back to his wife, who's now in charge of his entire fortune in his land. He's a prince, and he says, your dad has given me really nice gifts, but nothing can compare to the gifts this man gives. Talking about Alexios. And those were just general offerings that the emperor could offer. I mean, that's what we cannot conceptualize the wealth, both spiritual and then physical monetary wealth that the Byzantine Empire had. And they were the true Romans. They were the heirs of the Roman Empire. And that's why the West despised them, because they were the true heritage. They were the true church. They were the true theology. As we saw that the Crusades developed these new theological understandings of penitence and indulgence and sacred wars. And all your sins will be forgiven as long as you die in a crusade. The Orthodox never heard of any of that. That's why I didn't even get into it, but that's why they thought these Crusaders were like theologically delusional. Because you're looking at a Byzantine army, a military, an entire imperial force that is dealing with these Muslims constantly. And yet they still have to do penitence before they receive the Eucharist. But the Catholics, they get forgiven of sins by the more people they kill, which led to, yes, atrocities. I mean, we're not here to promote Islam, but I mean, there were some horrors that occurred on behalf of the Crusades, because the Crusaders thought they couldn't do wrong as long as they were fighting the crusade, and if they died in battle, their sins were forgiven. They're going to go to heaven. That did not exist anywhere in the East. Boomer Slayer throws in 10, says, can't wait to catch up on this stream. Such a fascinating history. Yeah, I hope it was useful. It was tough to condense 4 Crusades into a 3-hour podcast, but I think we covered a lot of ground tonight. Blink throws in 25, says, late to the stream, throwing in money at the buzzer. Well, thank you so much, Blink4444. Appreciate that. The West is also more industrial and technical. Fits Cain perfectly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Look at Cain was upset with the offering that Abel gave to God. And look at the way in which the Byzantine Empire operated. Look at the wealth and look at the way they worshiped. And look at how Cain, the West, became jealous of what God had given them, the blessings that God bestowed on them. Yeah, it sounds just like jihadism. It is. That's what the point earlier is, that what the Catholic penitent doctrine of holy war and the Crusader becoming an official a lay occupation within the church, right? There's now, I doubt that exists anymore, but there was a literal role for lay crusaders to be part of the church, with the belief that if you go die, you get to go to heaven. It sounds very much like Islamic jihad. That's why the Orthodox, when the Crusaders came in the First Crusade and they heard about this, like, what? I thought you guys were coming to help us, reconquer Anatolia. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? You can't, all your sins are forgiven. Papal expansion, papal supreme. Where are you guys getting this stuff? Boomer Slayer says, my grandmother's Roman Catholic programming kicked in hard this last few weeks. I've never witnessed this before. Interesting. Armenians allowed the Crusades into the Holy City and even fed them. Yeah, the Armenians kind of go back and forth. The Armenians, you can't. There's so many instances in the history of Byzantium where the Armenians align with the Byzantines, then they align with the Muslims against the Byzantines, and then they go back and they realign. So the Armenians were very pragmatic. They would align with whoever benefited them the most, and being Christian did not demand any sort of loyalty. And in fact, it's one of the critiques of the Byzantines, of the Armenians, is that they were very, very sympathetic to the papacy. Now, the Armenians are not Eastern Orthodox, right? They don't recognize Chalcedon. So the Armenian church is not part of our church and hadn't been, even though the Armenians were the first nation to convert to Christianity. But the Armenians had no loyalty to the Byzantines. And in fact, in multiple examples throughout history, they showed more loyalty to the Roman and the Latins. I mean, I should say Rome and the Latins, not the Romans, that would be the Byzantines, but to the Latins. And so, you know, historically, you couldn't trust the Armenians. They would do what was ever best for them. Jason throws in 10. Thank you very much. He says, DPH came in very late. We'll watch tonight. What books do you recommend about the Crusades from the perspective of Eastern Orthodox? Sorry if you already mentioned this. I did not use any specific text. I just started searching like Crusades from an Orthodox Christian perspective, Crusades from a Byzantine perspective. There's a handful of articles. Again, I use Brave Browser, but if you go on Brave Browser and search that, you'll see a handful of academic articles show up. And then mostly I just tried to learn about the agreements. What was Alexios' agreement with the First Crusade, Manuel with the Second Crusade, so on and so forth. And then, so that was more of the preparation for today's stream, was just to figure out the historical timeline of events, what the Byzantine perspective was, and then how the Byzantines engaged with the Latins. So I apologize. I don't have a specific book. Maybe AI could help you with a specific book. I just read a bunch of articles, and then I watched a bunch of documentaries, and then I used the documentaries we watched today to find sections that highlighted the thing that I wanted to discuss. So that's how I did it. But thank you very much, Jason, for the support. KLW throws in 5, says, it's debatable between the Armenians and the Georgians being first. I've recently heard arguments that the Georgians being first. Okay, potentially. I mean, I know what is generally believed by history is that it was the Armenians. But remember, we didn't even get to St. David the Builder. Remember, we've done streams on St. David the Builder. And he was the king of Georgia during the First Crusade. During the First Crusade. If you remember our stream on King David, we talked about that, how he actually allied with, I think, Baldwin and Raymond of Toulouse and the Byzantine Empire. So he was kind of a third party that was friendly with both, but he was a great Orthodox king, a holy warrior king for sure. So we didn't even get into him and his dad, George II. All of that tied into the discussion today because it was George II that was ruling during the loss at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. So, and then over on Streamlabs, BMX 1966 throws in $6 and says, "Good day, DPH. Did you get my last super chat?" And he said, "Good day, DPH. Are Knights of Malta part of the Freemasons?" The Knights of Malta. I don't know if they're part of the Freemasons, like speculative Freemasonry. I don't believe so. I mean, you could say there's probably some similarities there. Yeah, no, it's not part of... I'm pretty sure it's just a Catholic religious order, the Knights of Malta. I don't believe it has anything to do with Freemasonry, but you can imagine many of these Catholic religious groups, I would imagine many of the members are probably Freemasons, if you will. I don't know. I don't know what the Catholic Church's stance. I've heard Tradcath say you can't be a Mason and be Catholic, but I've met multiple Catholic guys, successful guys that are also Masons. So I don't know how exactly that works or if the Catholic Church still upholds to that. But my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, anyone in the chat, the Knights of Malta is really a Catholic religious order, not so much anything to do with speculative Freemasonry. So, the Byzantine historian Nikitas set history called O City of Byzantium covers the Fourth Crusade and its aftermath from a contemporary Byzantine perspective. Yeah, well, we mentioned if you want, okay, so if you guys want primary sources regarding the Crusades, I already mentioned this earlier, is the Alexiad by the daughter of Alexios I, Anna Kamne, and Nikitas Choniatis was the witness to the 1204 sacking of Constantinople. So those two are primary sources, and there are other primary sources. Those were just the most notable because I focused today on the First Crusade and the Fourth Crusade. And so those are the two notable primary sources. If that's what you're interested in, you guys want to get into a primary source, check out those. The Alexiad, which was the daughter of Alexios I, who wrote the history of the First Crusade, and then Nikitas Choniatis, who wrote a witness of the 1204 sacking of Constantinople. So those are primary sources if you guys want to get into it. So anyways, let me just double check. I think that does it for me, guys. I'm going to be back Wednesday with a Logos news stream because something's going to happen Tuesday night. We don't exactly know. Is Trump going to resume the war with Iran? Are we going to get peace negotiations? Is the war over? We don't know, but Wednesday will be the day that we will know. And so tomorrow night, if anybody's interested, we're going to be in the men's only community, the Logos Academy. And we're going to be diving into all the geopolitics. We're going to be doing a group discussion. There's no preparatory homework, no reading or anything. It's just guys getting into talking about the latest happenings in geopolitics, the Iran war, the globalist elite, satanic pedophile elite trying to entrap us and ensnare us into their schemes. So that's going to be, the meeting is tomorrow night at 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time for anybody interested. And then the stream will be Wednesday. So I will be back Wednesday. Bayou says, there are not many Knight orders surviving to this day. I think it's like 3. Yeah. So let the Holy Land into the hand of the Islamic heretics, huh? This person's clearly not very sophisticated. We just broke down a nuanced 3-hour stream on the Crusade from an Orthodox perspective, and this is what we get. This is what we get. Wonderful. Okay. All right, guys. Well, that's going to do it for me. Thank you all so much. A major appreciation to the generous support tonight from you guys. We're able to reach the goal. Shout out to Rachel Wilson. Shout out to everyone who supported tonight. Nathaniel, KLW, Great Scott, Octavian, Texas Nevsky, Mr. Fist, all you guys. Wood Floor Alchemist, thank you all so much for the support. And I will see you guys Wednesday. As always, until then, God bless.